7 years. That's how long Jason Carter lived without knowing he was a father. Then a phone call arrived at 11:47 on a Tuesday night. 3 words from a stranger that collapsed his entire understanding of his own life. Emily is gone. And somewhere in a county hospital 40 miles away, a 7-year-old girl with her mother's eyes was sitting alone in a fluorescent-lit room, waiting for someone who might never come. This is the story of what Jason did next, and why it cost him everything before it gave him something worth keeping. If this story moves you, hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me. Every part matters. The night it happened, Jason Carter was doing what he did most evenings. Sitting at the kitchen table of a farmhouse that was too quiet, eating something he hadn't bothered to cook properly, staring at seed catalogs he wasn't really reading. Outside, the Oregon rain was doing its usual thing. Not dramatic, not a storm, just that relentless Pacific Northwest drizzle that came down so fine you almost didn't notice it until your jacket was completely soaked through. The kind of rain that didn't ask permission. It just arrived and stayed. The farmhouse was 12 acres outside a town called Mill Haven. Population just under 4,000, 2 stoplights, 1 decent diner, and the kind of community where people waved at each other from their trucks without necessarily knowing each other's names. Jason had inherited the land from his grandfather 3 years earlier, and he'd been quietly failing at making it profitable ever since. He grew some vegetables. He kept a small greenhouse for early season starts that he sold at the Saturday market in town. He did odd jobs for neighboring farms when cash ran short. It wasn't a life anyone would look at from the outside and call successful, but it was his, and he'd gotten used to its particular shape. His phone was on the table beside the seed catalog. He almost didn't pick it up when it rang. Unknown number, and it was close to midnight. His first instinct was to let it go to voicemail. He picked it up anyway. "Is this Jason Carter?" The voice was a woman's. Professional, careful. The way people sound when they've been trained to deliver bad news without letting it become their own. "Yeah," he said. "Who's calling?" "My name is Sandra Okafor. I'm a social worker with the Oregon Department of Human Services. I'm sorry to be contacting you at this hour, Mr. Carter. I need to ask you a few questions about your relationship with a woman named Emily Brooks." He hadn't heard that name in 7 years, and in the space of the 3 seconds it took him to process it, something in his chest did a strange thing. Lurched forward and then pulled back at the same time, like his body was trying to prepare for 2 opposite emotions at once. "Emily?" he said. The word came out flat, not a question. "Yes." Emily Brooks, 31 years old, formerly of Portland, most recently residing in Clover Falls. Do you know her? "I knew her," he said carefully. "We were together a long time ago. What's this about?" There was a brief pause on the other end. Sandra Okafor took what sounded like a measured breath. "Mr. Carter, I'm very sorry to inform you that Ms. Brooks passed away yesterday evening. She suffered a cardiac event. It was sudden, and the medical team was unable to revive her." Jason sat very still. Outside, the rain kept coming down in that patient, indifferent way. "I'm sorry," he said, "because that was what you said, even when you were still trying to locate the feeling underneath the words." "Mr. Carter, the reason I'm calling you specifically is that Miss Brooks listed you in her personal documents as a potential contact regarding her daughter. Her name is Sophie. She's 7 years old." Jason's hand tightened around the phone. "She has a daughter," he said. "Yes. Sophie has been in our temporary care since yesterday evening. There are no other immediate family members able to assume guardianship. Ms. Brooks' parents are deceased and she had no siblings. You are the only person named in her documents as a potential contact." "Why would Emily list me?" he started, and then stopped. He did the math. The way you do it fast, without wanting to, the numbers arriving before you've given them permission. 7 years ago, he and Emily had broken up. They'd been together for almost 2 years, a difficult, tangled, ultimately failed relationship that had ended badly on a Tuesday night in a Portland apartment with both of them saying things they couldn't unsay. She had left. He hadn't followed. He told himself for years that she was the one who walked out the door, that he'd been the wrong party, that the way things ended wasn't his fault. He'd built a whole internal architecture around that story. And now, in the span of a 10-second phone call, every supporting beam of that architecture cracked straight down the middle. "Mr. Carter," Sandra Okafor said, "are you still there?" "Sophie is 7, he said. "Yes. Emily and I broke up 7.5 years ago." A pause. "I understand." "She never told me. It wasn't a question. He already knew it wasn't a question." "She never—" He stopped, pressed his hand flat against the kitchen table. The grain of the wood was rough under his palm. He focused on that. The physical reality of the table. The solidity of something that didn't require him to feel anything. "Is Sophie okay?" "She's physically healthy. She's had a very difficult day, as you can imagine. She's currently in a temporary placement, but Mr. Carter, I need to be direct with you about the timeline. There is an emergency custody hearing scheduled for tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. If no appropriate guardian is identified, Sophie will enter long-term foster care." "Tomorrow morning?" "Yes. I know this is an enormous amount of information to receive in a single phone call at this hour, and I genuinely wish I had more time to give you, but the hearing is scheduled and I needed to contact you tonight." Jason stood up from the table. He walked to the window. The rain was silver under the yard light. He pressed his forehead briefly against the cold glass and then pulled back. "What do I need to do?" he said. Well, he didn't sleep that night. Not really. He lay down at some point, stared at the ceiling, got up, walked to the kitchen, made coffee, he barely drank, and then sat at the table with a legal pad and tried to make a list of things he knew. It was a habit he'd developed in his 20s. When something overwhelmed him, he wrote it down in columns. It gave his hands something to do and his brain the illusion of control. What he knew? He had a daughter. Her name was Sophie. She was 7 years old. She had brown hair in the one photograph Sandra Okafor had texted him. A school photo, the kind with the fake blue gradient background. Sophie looking directly at the camera with an expression that was trying very hard to be a smile and not quite getting there. She had Emily's eyes. Wide set, dark, the kind that gave away nothing while seeming to offer everything. She had his jaw. He sat with that for a while. What else he knew? He had 9 hours before a custody hearing where he would need to demonstrate that he could provide a stable home environment. Sandra Okafor had been careful but honest with him on the phone. The court would be looking at several things: his living situation, his financial stability, his employment record, his support network. And the thing she had mentioned almost gently, as though trying to soften a blow that couldn't be softened, his relationship status. Family court judges in emergency hearings tend to look favorably on two-parent households, she had said. It's not a requirement, but it's a significant factor. A single individual, especially one with no prior relationship to the child, faces a higher evidentiary burden. "I'm her father," he'd said. "Paternity would need to be confirmed," she'd replied carefully. And even if confirmed, a first-time single parent with a modest income and no established relationship with the child. She'd paused. "I want to help you, Mr. Carter. I'm telling you what I know about how these hearings typically go." So there it was. On the legal pad, in his own handwriting, at 1:15 in the morning, single, limited income, no prior relationship with child, 9 hours. He sat back and looked at what he'd written for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone and found a contact he hadn't called in almost a year. He'd met Victoria Sinclair at a charity auction in Portland 14 months ago, an event he'd attended only because his neighbor, Dan Reyes, had bought 2 tickets and his wife couldn't go. Jason had worn his only decent jacket and spent most of the evening standing near the appetizer table, feeling profoundly out of place in a room full of people who wore watches that cost more than his truck. Victoria had been the keynote speaker for the Children's Education Fund that was the evening's beneficiary. He remembered being surprised by her, not by her success, which he'd read about beforehand, but by the way she spoke. Not smooth, not polished the way he'd expected. She'd stumbled once, halfway through a sentence about early childhood literacy, and she'd caught herself and said, "Sorry, I had a whole prepared thing to say here, and I just decided I don't want to say it," and then told a story about a kid she'd met at one of the funded schools who had read his first full sentence out loud and cried. She'd been direct and a little awkward and completely genuine, and the room had responded to her more warmly than to any rehearsed speech. They'd spoken briefly at the end of the evening, a conversation about the rain of all things, because it had started pouring as the event ended and they were both waiting under the venue's inadequate awning for cars. She'd laughed at something he said. He'd gotten her business card. He'd sent her a thank you email about a week later, something low stakes, referencing the conversation. She'd replied. They'd exchanged maybe a dozen messages over the following months. Occasional, comfortable, never quite escalating into anything, but never quite fading either. He knew, in the way you sometimes just know things, that she was not entirely indifferent to him. But he'd never pushed it further. His life wasn't exactly a compelling pitch. Now, at 1:20 in the morning, he was about to call her and ask something that he knew, even as he was dialing, was completely unreasonable. She picked up on the fourth ring. Her voice was alert, which surprised him. "Jason Carter," she said. "It's past 1 in the morning." "I know," he said. "I'm sorry, something happened." He heard something shift on her end, a change in her posture, maybe, or just in her attention. "Are you okay?" "No," he said. "Not especially. I need to tell you something and I need to ask you something, and both of them are going to sound insane, so I'm asking you to stay on the line and hear me out before you respond." A beat. "Okay." He told her everything. He didn't try to soften it or frame it strategically. He just told her. Emily, the phone call, Sophie's photograph, the custody hearing, what Sandra Okafor had said about single-parent households, all of it. He talked for 11 minutes without stopping, and when he finished, the line was quiet for a moment that felt much longer than it probably was. "You're asking me to marry you," Victoria said finally. Her voice was absolutely unreadable. "Temporarily," he said. "On paper. Long enough to satisfy the court that Sophie would be coming into a stable two-parent home. After what? After the hearing, after guardianship is established. We'd file for divorce whenever you want. I'd make sure there were no financial complications. No, Jason, I know how this sounds. Do you?" Her tone had shifted, not angry exactly, something sharper than that. "Because what it sounds like is that you're calling me in the middle of the night to ask me to legally bind myself to you so that a family court will look more favorably on a custody case for a child you didn't know existed 6 hours ago." "Yes," he said. "That's exactly what I'm asking." Another pause. "Why me?" It was a fair question. He'd thought about it while he was dialing. "Because you've spent years quietly working on child welfare causes. Because I think you understand what it means for a kid to not have a safe place to go. And because—" He stopped, decided to be honest rather than strategic. "Because I don't have anyone else I could call and not feel ashamed asking." The line was quiet again. He could hear her breathing. "Tell me about the farm," she said. He blinked. "What?" "The farm, where you live. Describe it to me." He looked around the kitchen, at the wood floors that needed refinishing, the window over the sink with the cracked sill he'd been meaning to repair for 2 winters, the table where he'd just spent an hour writing on a legal pad. "It's a 12-acre property in Millhaven," he said slowly. 3-bedroom farmhouse. It's old. It needs work. I have a greenhouse and a small market garden. It's not—" He exhaled. "It's not impressive." "Is it safe?" "Yes." "Is it a place a child could grow up?" He thought about the fields in the morning when the fog was still sitting low over the grass, the big oak at the edge of the property that had a branch low enough to climb, the way the kitchen smelled when he made soup on cold days. "Yes," he said. "I think so." "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly," Victoria said. "Not strategically. Honestly." "Okay. Do you actually want this child? Not out of guilt? Not because someone is forcing your hand. Do you want to be her father?" The answer arrived before he'd finished deciding to answer. "I've been looking at her photograph for 6 hours," he said. "She has my jaw. She was sitting alone in a hospital waiting room when someone took that school picture, and she doesn't have anyone." He stopped. His voice had gone rough at the edges in a way he hadn't planned. "Yeah, I want her." The line was quiet for 10 seconds. Then Victoria said, Pick me up at 7. Bring whatever documentation you have. And Jason, yeah? If you're lying to me about any of this, I will find out. And I am not a person you want to have as an enemy. I know, he said. I'm not lying. Then I'll see you at 7, I said. He showed up at 6:47. She was already waiting at the front entrance of her building, a high-rise in the Pearl District, one of the newer glass towers that reflected the morning sky in cool blue panels. She was dressed simply, dark jeans, a gray blazer, no jewelry except small stud earrings. Her hair was pulled back. She was carrying a leather portfolio and a coffee she handed to him without ceremony as he stepped out of the truck. "You look terrible," she said, looking at him plainly. "I didn't sleep." "I know. You sound like it on the phone, too." She walked around to the passenger side and got in. He got back behind the wheel. The truck was 10 years old and smelled faintly of soil and diesel and the fast food he'd eaten 2 days ago. He watched her take in the state of the cab and say nothing about it, which he appreciated. "Before we get there," she said, "I want to be clear about something." "Okay." "I'm not doing this because I feel sorry for you." He glanced at her briefly and then back at the road. "Then why are you doing it?" She was quiet for a moment, not evasive, thinking. "I've been involved in child welfare advocacy for 6 years, she said finally. "I've seen what happens to kids who fall through the cracks of the system. They don't disappear. They just end up somewhere worse than where they started. And Sophie," she stopped. "You told me last night that she was sitting alone in a hospital room, that she was in a temporary placement, that without something changing in the next 9 hours, she enters long-term foster care as a child with no identified family." She paused. "I am not doing this because you asked me to. I'm doing it because she shouldn't have to go through that if there's an alternative." "Okay," Jason said, "but I need you to understand something else," she said, and her voice had an edge in it now. Not hostile, but precise the way a blade is precise. "I've read enough about you to know that you're not the worst person in the world. But you're also not entirely without fault here. Emily didn't tell you about Sophie, that's true. But from what you've told me, the relationship ended badly enough that she apparently made a deliberate decision not to." He kept his eyes on the road. "Yeah. So while I'm here to help, I'm not here to simply validate your side of the story. The little girl we're going to go fight for has every right to be angry. Her mother just died. She's in a system she doesn't know. And the father she's meeting for the first time today is a stranger who, as far as she's concerned, was absent for 7 years." "I know," he said. "Do you?" She turned to look at him directly. "Because last night you told me you'd been building a story about how the relationship ended that put most of the blame on Emily, and I'm going to ask you to put that story down. Not for my sake, for Sophie's." Jason didn't answer immediately. The truck moved through morning Portland traffic. A bus pulled in front of them. A cyclist in yellow rain gear crossed against the light. Normal Thursday morning city things that had no knowledge of what he was driving toward. "I put it down last night," he said finally. "Around 2 a.m. Victoria looked at him for another moment. Then she turned back to face forward. "Okay," she said. "Let's go get your daughter." The family court building in downtown Portland was a concrete block of a structure that made no effort to be anything other than functional. The hallways had fluorescent lighting and the kind of institutional linoleum floor that had been scuffed by 10,000 pairs of nervous shoes. Jason had been in courthouses before, minor things, a parking dispute once, a contractor issue. But nothing that felt like this. Nothing that felt like his entire future was being weighed by strangers in a room he'd never been in before. Sandra Okafor met them in the hallway outside the hearing room. She was a compact woman in her mid-40s with close-cropped hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She looked at Victoria with a measured, professional expression that gave nothing away. "Mr. Carter," she said, and "Ms. Sinclair," Victoria said, extending her hand. "Victoria Sinclair. I'm Jason's wife." They hadn't been married yet. That part had happened at 8:15 that morning in a county clerk's office 3 blocks away, conducted by a civil commissioner who had the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone performing their 40th ceremony of the quarter. It had taken 11 minutes. Victoria had signed with a clear, decisive hand and said nothing sentimental. Jason had done the same. Neither of them had kissed. It seemed like the wrong thing to manufacture. But the paperwork was real. The certificate was in Victoria's portfolio. Sandra Okafor looked at Victoria for a moment, then at Jason. Something shifted behind her eyes. Yeah, not surprise exactly. Assessment. "You got married this morning," she said. "We've been together for over a year," Victoria said with complete composure. "The circumstances accelerated our timeline." It was not technically a lie. They had known each other for over a year. The rest was creative framing, and Victoria delivered it without a visible seam. "I see," Sandra said carefully. She looked at Jason again. "The hearing will be before Judge Patricia Ham. She runs a very direct proceeding. She will ask you direct questions, and she will expect direct answers. She has no patience for performances." "Understood," Jason said. Sandra held his gaze for another beat. "I want Sophie to have a family, Mr. Carter. I've been in this job for 16 years. I'm not easily impressed. But what I care about, the only thing I care about, is that little girl in there." She glanced at the double doors at the end of the hall. "Don't make me regret making this call." Judge Patricia Ham was exactly as advertised. 60-something, silver-haired, with reading glasses she wore low on her nose, and a manner that communicated she had neither time nor interest in anything that wasn't directly relevant to the child in question. She looked at Jason across the courtroom with the kind of expression that made him feel like she was reading something written on the inside of his skull. The county attorney presented the basic facts. Emily Brooks, deceased. Sophie Brooks, age 7, no identified family, no established prior relationship with either petitioner. Jason Carter, listed as a potential contact in the deceased's personal effects. The attorney noted that paternity had not been legally established. Judge Ham looked at Jason. "Mr. Carter, you were informed of Sophie's existence last night." "Yes, Your Honor." "You had no prior knowledge that Ms. Brooks was pregnant or that this child existed?" "No, Your Honor." "And yet you're here, in my courtroom, married." She glanced at the certificate Victoria had provided as of approximately 8:15 this morning, asking this court for emergency temporary guardianship of a child you've never met. Put that way, it sounded exactly as audacious as it was. Jason didn't flinch from it. "Yes, Your Honor." "Tell me why I should grant that," she said. He had thought about this. He had run through versions of the answer in the truck on the way over. But in the moment, sitting in the hard chair with the fluorescent light overhead and the judge's gaze on him, every prepared version dissolved. What was left was just the truth. "Because she doesn't have anyone else," he said. "Because she lost her mother yesterday, and she's 7 years old, and she's sitting somewhere right now in a building she doesn't know with people she's never met. And I know I'm a stranger to her. I know I have no history with her to point to, but she's mine, and I want her. I know that's not enough on its own, but it's where I start from." Judge Ham looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned to Sandra Okafor. "Your assessment, Ms. Okafor." Sandra was quiet for a beat that felt like several minutes. "The Carter-Sinclair household represents the only identified family connection for this child," she said carefully. "Based on my preliminary assessment and the documentation provided, I believe a temporary placement pending full evaluation is in Sophie's best interest. With the provision that regular home visits and psychological support for Sophie are built into any guardianship agreement." Judge Ham wrote something. She looked at Victoria. "Ms. Sinclair, Carter, what is your role in this child's care going to be?" Victoria didn't hesitate. "Whatever she needs," she said. "I'm not going to stand here and tell you I know what kind of mother I'll be. I've never done this before, but I'm telling you that I'll show up every day and figure it out. And I have the resources to make sure that Sophie has everything she needs: school, therapy, stability, whatever she needs." The judge held Victoria's gaze. Then she wrote something else. "I'm granting temporary guardianship pending a full home evaluation in 60 days, she said. "This is not a permanent arrangement. I will be reviewing this case closely. Sophie will be assigned a court-appointed advocate who will report directly to me. Any indication that this placement is not in her best interest, and we revisit." She looked at Jason. "Mr. Carter, she's a child who just lost her mother. Whatever you think you're ready for, be readier." "Yes, Your Honor," he said. "Court is adjourned." They brought Sophie out 40 minutes later. Sandra Okafor had suggested they wait in a small family meeting room down the hall, a room clearly designed to be warm, with colored chairs and a low table and a bookshelf with children's books in it. Jason sat in one of the colored chairs, which was too small for him. Victoria stood near the window. Neither of them spoke. When the door opened, Sophie walked in with a social worker named Deb, a heavy-set woman with kind eyes who was holding Sophie's hand but not gripping it. The girl let go of Deb's hand immediately once they were through the doorway. That independence felt like information. Sophie was small for 7, dark hair that wasn't combed quite right, hanging a little unevenly around her face in a way that suggested someone had tried but hadn't known how she usually wore it. She was wearing jeans and a blue sweatshirt that had a cartoon whale on it. She had a stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm, worn at the ears, clearly old. And she was carrying it with the casual, slightly protective grip of a kid who had decided it wasn't babyish to have a stuffed animal because she had simply decided that. She looked at Jason, and then she looked away. Not shyly, not nervously. With the careful, deliberate disinterest of a child who had decided in advance not to give anything away. "Hi, Sophie," Jason said. His voice came out steadier than he expected. She didn't answer right away. She looked at the bookshelf, looked at Victoria, looked back at Jason. "You're him?" she said finally. "Yes," he said. "My mom had a picture of you," Sophie said. "You had different hair." "It was a long time ago," he said. "I know." Her voice was flat, not rude, just factual, in the way children sometimes are when they're protecting themselves by speaking only in facts. "She kept it in a box. I found it once." She paused. "She didn't know I found it." Jason didn't say anything. Sophie finally moved into the room fully, coming to stand in front of the low table. She looked at Victoria. "Who are you?" "My name is Victoria," she said. "I'm married to Jason." Sophie seemed to consider this. "You're rich," she said, looking at Victoria's blazer with the frank assessment of a child who hasn't yet learned that pointing these things out is considered rude. Victoria actually almost smiled. "Yes." "Is your house nicer than his?" "My apartment is," Victoria said. "His farm is different." "A farm," Sophie repeated. She looked at Jason again with that same flat, measuring look. "My mom said you had a farm." "She told you about me?" Jason said, and he couldn't quite keep the note of surprise out of his voice. Sophie looked at him with an expression that was too old for her face. "She told me some things," she said carefully, in a way that was clearly designed to give him nothing further. Then she tucked the rabbit more firmly under her arm and walked to the bookshelf and pulled out a book and sat down on the floor with it, opening it like the conversation was finished. Deb, the social worker, caught Jason's eye from the doorway and gave him a small nod that said, "Give her time." He gave her time. He sat in the too small colored chair and watched a 7-year-old girl with his jaw and her mother's eyes read a picture book on the floor of a courthouse family room, her brow furrowed slightly, her rabbit propped up beside her like a witness. And he stayed right there until she was ready to do something else. She looked up at him, eventually, near the end of the book. She didn't say anything. She just looked at him with that flat, evaluating gaze like she was measuring something she hadn't decided how to measure yet. He didn't look away. Neither did she. They drove to Millhaven that afternoon. Sophie sat in the back seat of Jason's truck with her rabbit and a backpack that held everything she currently owned, a fact that hit Jason like something physical when Deb had handed it to him. One backpack, a 7-year-old, and it all fit in one backpack. Victoria sat in the passenger seat. No one said much for the first half hour. The radio was off. The rain had paused, and the hills along the highway were that saturated, almost unreal green that Oregon pulled off in autumn. Sophie broke the silence. "Do you have animals?" she asked from the back seat. "A dog," Jason said. "Her name is Mabel. She's pretty old. She mostly sleeps." "What kind?" "Mutt, brown and white. She has one ear that flops wrong." A pause. "Does she bite?" "Never once in her life." Another pause. "Okay. Then, do you have chickens?" "No, but there's space for them if someone wanted to." He heard something in the back seat. Not quite a sound. more like the absence of the tight, careful silence that had been there before. He didn't push it. The farm came into view as the afternoon light was going gold and low over the fields. The farmhouse at the end of the gravel drive, the greenhouse to the left, the big oak at the edge of the field throwing a long shadow across the grass. Mabel was waiting on the porch as if she'd known they were coming, her one floppy ear tilted sideways, her tail doing its slow, elderly wag. Sophie got out of the truck and stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. Mabel came down one step, sniffed the air, then came down the rest of the steps and walked directly to Sophie and put her head against the girl's hand. Sophie stood very still. Then, carefully, she put her hand on Mabel's head. She didn't say anything. She didn't look up, but her shoulders, which had been held tight and high since the moment Jason had first seen her in that courthouse room, came down about half an inch. It wasn't trust. It wasn't even close to trust, but it was something, the first small thread of something. Jason stood on the gravel drive and watched the old dog and the girl who was his daughter. And the evening came down around all of them, and he didn't know what the next day would look like, or the one after that. He had a 7-year-old child who looked at him like a stranger she was trying to decide whether to be careful around. He had a temporary marriage to a woman who was brilliant and guarded, and had agreed to this for reasons that were only partially about him. He had a farm that needed work, and a heart that needed work, and a daughter who was going to hold him accountable in ways he couldn't predict for every year he hadn't been there. He didn't know if he was enough, but he was going to find out. That first night he made dinner. Nothing special, pasta, a sauce from a jar because he hadn't had time to shop, some bread he'd had in the freezer. Victoria quietly took over reheating the bread without being asked, locating things in the kitchen with the practical efficiency of someone who preferred to be useful over being waited on. Sophie sat at the kitchen table with her rabbit and watched both of them move around each other in the small space. "It smells okay," she said finally, which was clearly the closest she was going to offer to a compliment at this stage. "Don't oversell it," Jason said. "It's jar sauce." She looked at him. The corner of her mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile but was in the same neighborhood as one. "Mom used to make that too," she said. "She said she was a bad cook." "She was," Jason said, before he thought better of it. Then he stopped. "Sorry, that was—" "She was," Sophie agreed quietly. She was looking at her plate now. "She burned everything." A pause. Her voice went very small, just for a second. "She burned it, but she always tried really hard." The kitchen was quiet. "I know," Jason said, even though he hadn't known Emily that way. Not in the kitchen, not in the small domestic dailiness of a life. But he said it because it was true in the way that mattered. He knew that Emily had loved her daughter with everything she had, and that was what Sophie needed him to say. Victoria didn't say anything. She served the bread and sat down and poured water from a pitcher and was simply, quietly present in the way that turned out to be exactly the right thing. They ate dinner together in that small Oregon kitchen, the three of them, surrounded by the sound of rain starting up again on the roof and the old dog shifting in her sleep near the heating vent, and no one said anything grand or significant. The pasta was average. The bread was better. Sophie ate 3 pieces of bread, which Jason filed away as useful information. After dinner, he made up the spare bedroom for Sophie. Clean sheets, the extra blanket from the closet, the small lamp from the hallway because the overhead was too bright. She stood in the doorway and looked at the room. "It's small," she said. "Yeah," he said. "It's okay." She went in and put her backpack on the floor and set her rabbit on the pillow with careful deliberateness and then turned around. She looked at Jason in the doorway with that measuring look. "You're going to say you're sorry," she said. "That's what grown-ups do when they don't know what else to say." He thought about denying it. He thought about reframing it. Instead, he said, "Yeah, probably. Is that okay?" She considered this with the gravity of a diplomat weighing a treaty. "Not yet," she said finally. "Tell me later when it means something." Then she turned around, picked up her rabbit, pulled back the covers, and got into bed fully clothed. He turned off the overhead light and left the small lamp on. He pulled the door mostly closed. He stood in the hallway for a moment afterward, his hand on the door frame, listening to the old house settle around him. Behind him, down the hall, Victoria appeared in the kitchen doorway, holding a mug of something. She looked at him. "How's she doing?" she asked quietly. He thought about it honestly. "She's holding together," he said. She's 7 years old and she lost her mother, and she's in a stranger's house, and she's holding together with everything she's got." Victoria nodded slowly. She looked at the closed door. Something moved across her face. Complex, private, the kind of thing she usually kept behind other expressions. Then it was gone. "She told me to wait to be sorry," he said. "Until it means something." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "Smart kid," she said. "Yeah," he said. He exhaled. The weight of the day settled fully on his shoulders. "Yeah, she is." Down the hall, behind the almost closed door, a 7-year-old girl with one worn rabbit and one backpack full of everything she owned lay in a small bedroom in a stranger's farmhouse and stared at the ceiling, her jaw set in a way that looked, in the low lamplight, exactly like her father's. She didn't cry. Not that night, but she held her rabbit very tight. Sophie lasted exactly 4 days before she stopped being polite about it. Not that she'd been particularly polite to begin with. But in those first 4 days, she'd maintained a kind of careful, watchful neutrality, answering questions in short sentences, eating what was put in front of her without complaint, following the loose structure of the day without pushing against it. She'd been, in the clinical language Jason imagined Sandra Okafor might use, cooperative. And Jason, who knew enough about children to understand that cooperative and okay were two entirely different things, had given her space and waited. On the 5th morning, he knocked on her bedroom door at 7:15 to tell her breakfast was ready. "I know what you did," she said through the door. He stood in the hallway. "What do you mean?" The door opened. Sophie was already dressed, jeans and a red long-sleeve shirt, her hair pulled into a lopsided ponytail that she'd clearly done herself. She was holding her rabbit under one arm and looking at him with an expression that had made a decision sometime during the night. "I heard you on the phone, last night, talking to the lady from the court." Sandra Okafor had called the previous evening for a routine check-in. Jason had taken it in the kitchen, speaking quietly, thinking Sophie was already asleep. He had not been sufficiently quiet. "What did you hear?" he said carefully. "Enough." She stepped past him into the hallway. "You married her to get me. The rich lady. You married her because they were going to put me somewhere else." He didn't deny it. He'd learned fast that she had a precision instrument for detecting when adults were softening the truth, and that she responded to it with a cold that was worse than anger. "That's part of it," he said. She stopped in the hallway, turned to look at him. "What's the other part?" "I wanted you," he said. "I found out you existed, and I wanted you." "You didn't know I existed," she said flatly. "So that doesn't count." "Sophie, you didn't know because you left." Her voice had gone very still, not loud, not shaking, just precise and final, the way a door sounds when it closes firmly. "You left my mom, and you never came back, and she didn't tell you because—" She stopped. Her jaw worked for a second. The rabbit was pressed hard under her arm. "I don't know why she didn't tell you. She never said, but you left first." "Yes," he said. "I did." She looked at him. He didn't try to explain it further or soften it or add qualifications. He'd thought a lot in those 4 days about what Victoria had said in the truck. Put that story down. And he'd put it down. Whatever had happened between him and Emily, whatever the competing accounts were of who had done what and whose fault the ending was, none of it changed the fundamental fact. He had not been there. He had not known. And Emily had made a decision, for whatever reason she had, to keep it that way. The reasons were hers, and she had taken them with her, and Sophie didn't need to carry them. "Okay," Sophie said finally. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't anything close. It was the particular way a child says okay when they've decided to file something away for later, in a drawer they're not finished with. She turned and walked down the hallway toward the kitchen. He followed her. Victoria was already up. She was at the kitchen table with her laptop open and a coffee beside her, working. She'd been on Portland time since they arrived, taking calls and emails from what Jason gathered was a company that did not slow down simply because its founder was temporarily living on a farm in Mill Haven. She looked up when Sophie came in, noted the girl's expression with the quiet perceptiveness she seemed to apply to most situations, and said nothing about it. "There's oatmeal," she said instead. "Jason made it. I have no opinion on whether it's good." "It's fine," Jason said, going to the stove. Sophie sat down at the table across from Victoria, deposited her rabbit on the chair beside her, and looked at the laptop screen with frank curiosity. "What are you working on?" "A proposal for a school construction project," Victoria said without looking up. 42 schools in 3 rural counties that need structural upgrades. We're trying to convince the state to match our funding. What happens if they don't? We find another way. She finally looked up. There's always another way. You just have to be willing to be annoying about it. Sophie considered this. My mom said that, she said, not about schools, but she said that thing, about there being another way. She paused. She was annoying about a lot of things. Good for her, Victoria said. Something in Sophie's face shifted, not softening exactly, but losing one layer of its armor, the outermost one, the one that required the most energy to maintain. She looked down at the table. Yeah, she said quietly. She was good at it. Jason set a bowl of oatmeal in front of her. She poked it with her spoon. It needs brown sugar, she said. There's brown sugar in the cabinet, he said. She got up and found it herself, which he'd half expected. She was that kind of kid, not demanding, but determined to do things for herself wherever possible, as though self-sufficiency were a form of armor she was not willing to set down. He watched her shake brown sugar onto her oatmeal with the focused concentration of someone doing something that mattered, and he thought about how Emily must have raised her. Alone, in an apartment in Clover Falls, working whatever job she'd had, coming home to this small, fierce, self-possessed girl. He didn't know the details, and he suspected he never fully would, but the evidence of who Sophie was, her independence, her sharpness, the way she held grief like something she refused to be broken by, said a lot about the mother who had raised her. He sat down with his own coffee. Sophie ate her oatmeal. Victoria worked. The rain started up again. Mabel came in from wherever she'd been sleeping and settled under the table near Sophie's feet with the proprietary ease of a dog who had decided something. It was not a comfortable morning, but it was a real one. The next 2 weeks were an education in what it actually meant to have a child in the house, as opposed to the abstract version Jason had spent one sleepless night trying to prepare himself for. The reality was louder, more complicated, and frequently more exhausting than the idea. Sophie needed rides to the school in Mill Haven that Sandra Okafor had arranged for her enrollment. She needed lunch packed. She had opinions about what went in the lunch, strong opinions, delivered without negotiation, about the precise ratio of acceptable to unacceptable items. She needed help with the Oregon State curriculum's approach to third-grade math, which turned out to differ from whatever she'd been doing in Clover Falls in ways that frustrated her deeply and vocally. She needed, on 2 separate occasions in the first week, to be talked down from a level of upset that wasn't about math at all, but was using math as its container. Jason handled most of it through a combination of trial, error, and the kind of improvisation he was more comfortable with in a greenhouse than in parenting. He got the lunch ratio wrong twice and received detailed feedback. He drove her to school in the mornings, which gave them 20 minutes in the truck that were sometimes silent and sometimes not. He sat with her at the kitchen table after school and worked through the math, which he was not particularly good at either, a fact he admitted, which seemed to make her feel somewhat better about her own struggles. Victoria, for her part, was navigating something she hadn't signed up for with the kind of methodical honesty that was, Jason was coming to understand, her default mode for almost everything. She'd taken up a temporary working arrangement from the farmhouse, her office in Portland handling the day-to-day, and while she spent several hours each day on calls and her laptop, she was present in the evenings in a way that felt genuine rather than performed. She didn't try to be maternal. She didn't try to fill any role she hadn't been asked to fill. She was simply there, and she paid attention, and she spoke to Sophie like someone who respected her intelligence. Sophie noticed. Kids always do. She doesn't talk to me like I'm little, Sophie said one afternoon, sitting on the porch steps while Jason was working on the greenhouse repair he'd been putting off for 2 months. She was watching him with the critical interest of someone evaluating whether his technique was adequate. Victoria? He said. Yeah. Sophie picked at a loose piece of wood on the step. Some grown-ups do that. Talk like you're an idiot because you're small. She doesn't do a lot of things the regular way, Jason said, fitting a new panel into the greenhouse frame. Sophie thought about this. Did you love her? Before? You know, before the thing with the court. He paused, set down the panel, looked at her. She was watching the middle distance with the casual expression she used when she was actually asking something important and didn't want it to look like that. We were friends, he said carefully. Something more than friends, I think. But we hadn't figured it out yet. But you called her. Yeah. Why her specifically? He picked up the panel again. Because I trusted her, he said, and because I thought she'd understand why Sophie mattered. Sophie was quiet for a moment. Then, she told me about the schools, the 42 ones. She said some of them hadn't had working heat in the winter for 3 years. That's a long time to be cold, Jason said. I told her she should be louder about it, on the news or whatever. Sophie paused. She said she's working on it. She said sometimes you have to pick where you're loud and where you're quiet. Smart, Jason said. I know, Sophie said, with the particular decisiveness of a child passing judgment. Then she stood up, brushed off her jeans, and went inside to get a snack. Mabel followed her. Jason held the greenhouse panel in place and thought about the fact that his 7-year-old daughter had just had a more substantive conversation with Victoria about advocacy strategy than most adults he knew. The kid was something else. He didn't know yet what to do with that. The pride and the guilt arriving at the same time as always. Inseparable. 2 things that needed to be held at once. The social worker came on day 18. Her name was Linda Cho, not Sandra Okafor, who handled the legal side, but a separate evaluator assigned by the court. She was in her 30s, brisk and observant, with a notebook she referred to constantly and a manner that was neither warm nor cold, but something in between that Jason understood was deliberate. She was there to look at the home, speak to Sophie, and write a report. She was not there to be won over. She was there to assess. She arrived on a Wednesday afternoon when Sophie was still at school, which gave her time to walk through the house with Jason. He'd cleaned, not performatively, but thoroughly, the way you clean when you know someone is going to look at the corners. He'd fixed the cracked windowsill. He'd organized the spare room Sophie was sleeping in, making sure her backpack was on the hook he'd installed, her books on the small shelf he'd added, the lamp adjusted so it actually worked properly. He'd put a small plant on the windowsill because it seemed like something, though he wasn't sure what. Linda Cho made notes. She asked about the sleeping arrangements. Sophie had her own room, yes, with a door that locked from the inside. Yes, Jason confirmed when asked. She asked about the kitchen, the food situation, the school enrollment. She asked about Jason's employment and income with the directness of someone who had seen too many people try to dress up inadequate finances. He told her the truth. Market garden income, occasional farm labor, modest savings. He did not pretend it was more than it was. And Miss Sinclair's involvement in the household finances, Linda said, pen ready. We're figuring that out, Jason said. Meaning? Meaning I'm not comfortable having her support Sophie financially in a way that disappears if she's not here, he said. I'm working on making the farm more viable. I have a meeting next week with a regional produce distributor. I want to build something that's mine. That's Sophie's part of. Linda looked at him for a moment and wrote something. He couldn't tell if it was good or bad. Victoria came in from her office space, the second bedroom she'd been using for calls, during Linda's visit, and they spoke for 20 minutes while Jason found things to do in the kitchen that weren't obviously just staying close enough to listen. He heard Victoria answer questions about her relationship with Sophie in the same direct, unembellished way she answered most questions. They were developing a relationship. It was early. She was not going to overstate it. When asked about her long-term commitment to the arrangement, she said, I'm here. How long-term that is depends on what's best for Sophie and what Jason and I figure out together. I'm not going to make promises about the future that I can't guarantee. What I can tell you is that I'm not going anywhere right now. Linda wrote something. Sophie came home at 3:30. She walked in the door, saw the unfamiliar woman at the kitchen table, and stopped. Her eyes went to Jason. "She's from the court," he said. "She just wants to talk to you for a little while. You don't have to say anything you don't want to say." Sophie looked at Linda Cho with the evaluating look. Then she set her backpack on the hook, put her rabbit on the chair beside her usual seat, and sat down. "Okay," she said. Jason and Victoria left the kitchen. They stood in the hallway without talking, which was its own kind of conversation. He could hear Sophie's voice and Linda's voice in alternating turns. Couldn't make out the words, which was probably appropriate. He leaned against the wall. Victoria sat on the bottom step of the staircase with her coffee and opened a document on her phone and pretended to read it. After 40 minutes, Linda Cho came out of the kitchen. Sophie did not follow her immediately, which felt meaningful. "She's a very," Linda paused, choosing her word, "self-possessed child." "Yeah," Jason said. "She told me she doesn't trust you yet." Linda said it matter-of-factly. "I want you to know that's in my notes, and it's not going to count against you in the way you might think. It counts for her, that she's honest about it." "She's honest about most things," Jason said. "She also told me," Linda looked at her notebook, then up, "that the farm smells like dirt, and she used to hate dirt, but she's getting used to it." Victoria made a sound that was almost a laugh and pressed her lips together. "I'll file my preliminary report by the end of the week," Linda said. "My recommendation will be to continue the temporary placement. You should receive written confirmation through Ms. Okafor's office." She put her notebook in her bag. "Mr. Carter, the 60-day evaluation is the one that carries more weight. I'd focus your energy there." After she left, Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway. She'd changed into jeans and her whale sweatshirt and was holding a cookie she'd apparently located in the cabinet. "She asked a lot of questions," she said. "I know," Jason said. "You okay?" She took a bite of the cookie. "She asked if I felt safe." "What did you say?" Sophie looked at him. Not the measuring look this time, something more complicated. "I said I didn't know yet," she said. "But that the dog was nice." She turned and went to find Mabel. He stood in the kitchen doorway and let out a breath that had been building for an hour. The farm's Saturday market was something Jason had been doing for 2 seasons. A table at the Millhaven Community Market where he sold starts, specialty greens, and whatever else the greenhouse had produced that week. It wasn't much, but it was steady, and the regulars knew him well enough to stop and talk. He'd been away from it for 3 weeks since Sophie arrived, and when he went back the first Saturday in October, he brought her with him. She was interested in the market in the way she was interested in most things, with a focused, particular attention that took in details other people missed. She watched how he talked to customers. She figured out the cash box system in about 4 minutes, and then, without being asked, started making change. An older woman named Dora, who always bought his mint and his basil, looked at Sophie and then at Jason with the kind of expression that needed no words. "Yours?" Dora said. "Mine," Jason said. Dora looked at Sophie, who was counting out 40 cents with great precision. "You're good at that?" Dora said. "I know," Sophie said. Dora bought twice as much mint as usual. By mid-morning, Sophie had reorganized the display layout, moving the starts to the front where they were more visible, grouping the cut herbs by type, and was managing change for small transactions with an efficiency that made Jason feel mildly shown up. He let her. She had Emily's organizational instinct, the kind that saw disorder as a problem to be solved, not a state to be tolerated. Around 11, a woman Jason knew vaguely, Carol Reyes, Dan's sister-in-law, stopped at the table and looked between Jason and Sophie with an expression that was friendly but curious in the way small-town curiosity can be. "I heard you had a daughter," she said to Jason. "Yeah," he said. Carol looked at Sophie. "How are you liking Millhaven?" Sophie looked up from the cash box. "It's small," she said, "but the trees are big." Carol laughed. She bought a tray of herb starts and left, and Sophie watched her go and then said to Jason quietly, without looking at him, "People are going to ask about my mom." He considered how to answer that. "Probably," he said. "What do I say?" "Whatever you want," he said. "You don't owe anyone the whole story." She thought about this, moved a bundle of time an inch to the left. She would have liked this, she said, not quite to him. The market. She liked places where people were doing things. A pause. She sold stuff online sometimes, made jewelry. It didn't make much money, but she liked it. It was the most she'd said about Emily since that second morning, and Jason knew enough not to reach for it or make it bigger than she'd offered. He just listened. She had a ring she made out of copper wire, Sophie said. She wore it all the time. I don't know where it is now. Her voice stayed flat, matter of fact, the way she kept all the grief-adjacent things flat. The hospital probably has her stuff. I can find out, Jason said. Sophie looked at him. Something moved through her face that she shut down quickly. Okay, she said. Then she turned back to the market and started straightening herb bundles again, and neither of them said anything more about it, but he wrote Emily's ring on the back of his hand in pen and did not forget it. Victoria appeared at noon with coffees and a bag of food she'd bought from another vendor. She'd come to the market on her own, which he hadn't expected. She sat on the tailgate of his truck with her coffee and her phone and worked her way through the food and occasionally looked up and watched the market with the focused attention she brought to everything. Sophie came over at some point and climbed up to sit beside her without asking, which Jason noticed from the other side of the table, but pretended not to notice. They sat there together. The woman who was technically Sophie's stepmother and the girl who had lost her mother, eating food from paper boats, watching the Millhaven market do its ordinary Saturday business. They didn't talk much. Victoria showed Sophie something on her phone at one point. Sophie made a comment. Victoria replied, "He couldn't hear what they were saying and it wasn't his. He sold out of Basel by 11:40 and the time by noon and drove home with an empty truck bed and $63 more than he'd had that morning, which wasn't much but was honest." That night, the thing that had been building between him and Victoria finally surfaced. Sophie was in bed. He'd checked twice, and she was actually asleep this time, her rabbit under her chin, her ponytail fanned out on the pillow in a way that made her look much younger than her daytime self. He came back downstairs to find Victoria at the kitchen table with a glass of wine and her laptop closed, which was unusual enough that he registered it before he sat down. "I need to tell you something," she said. He sat down across from her. "Okay." "I spoke to my attorney today," she said, "about the arrangement." She said it carefully, the word arrangement, but it sat between them with its full weight. "He thinks we should have a formal written agreement about what happens if—" She paused, chose her words. "If things change." Things changing meaning what? Meaning if the guardianship is made permanent and we subsequently separate. What Sophie's financial support looks like. What custody looks like. What your rights are. She held his gaze. "He's drawing up a document." Jason sat with this for a moment. It was entirely reasonable. It was the kind of thing a sensible person would do, especially a person with significant assets who had entered into a legal arrangement under unusual circumstances. It was also, somehow, harder to hear than he'd expected. "You're planning for the exit," he said. Not accusatory, just naming it. "I'm being practical," she said, "which is what I always am." "I know." He looked at his coffee cup. "It's the right thing to do." "But," she said, hearing the word he hadn't spoken. He looked up. "But I don't know how to think about what's happening here if part of my brain is always tracking the timeline to when you leave." Victoria was quiet for a moment. She turned her wine glass by the stem, a small, precise rotation. "I told you from the beginning what this was," she said. "You did," he said. "I'm not saying you lied. I'm saying—" He stopped, tried to be accurate. "I'm saying it turns out it's different, living it, than I thought it would be when I was on the phone at 1 a.m. asking you to do this. Different in ways I hadn't." He stopped again. He was bad at this, at articulating things he wasn't sure of yet. "I'm not asking you to change anything. I just wanted to say that." She looked at him across the table. The kitchen was quiet. The rain had stopped for once, and the silence was the specific kind that came when familiar ambient sound disappeared. She held his gaze longer than he expected. "The attorney is drawing up a document," she said. "That doesn't mean I've decided anything." "I know," he said. I don't make quick decisions about things that matter." She said it carefully, the way she said most things that were close to personal. I need you to understand that. When I move deliberately. I don't change direction because of feeling. The word had a slight edge to it, like she wasn't entirely comfortable with it. Feeling, he repeated. Don't make a thing of it, she said, and picked up her wine glass. He didn't make a thing of it, but he filed it carefully, the same way Sophie filed things in that internal drawer for examination later. The attorney's document arrived electronically on a Thursday, and Jason read it twice, asked one question about a clause regarding property, and signed it. He sent it back without drama. Victoria thanked him. They did not discuss it further. What they discussed instead that same evening was Sophie's school. Jason had gotten a call from her teacher, a young woman named Ms. Aldridge, who spoke with the careful tact of someone managing a situation she'd been trained to handle but hadn't personally encountered much. Sophie was academically strong, genuinely advanced in reading and verbal reasoning, Ms. Aldridge said, in a tone that suggested this was both wonderful and slightly exhausting. She was also, Ms. Aldridge said, struggling to connect with her classmates. Not acting out, Ms. Aldridge clarified quickly. Nothing like that. She's just... A pause. She's watching. She participates when asked. She does excellent work, but she hasn't made any friends yet, and it's been 3 weeks. Jason thought about this after the call, standing in the kitchen with his phone in his hand, and then he thought about himself at 7, which he rarely did. He'd been the kid who watched too, who sized things up before committing, who'd gotten it wrong often enough to learn that commitment was a thing you gave sparingly. Emily, he thought. She'd been the one who'd broken that open in him when they were young and it had still been possible. He understood, suddenly and with uncomfortable clarity, that Sophie was waiting to do the same thing he'd always done, waiting to see if the place was safe before she let herself be in it. He told Victoria about the call that night. She thought for a moment. Is she happy at the market? She said. More animated than anywhere else, he said. Then maybe she connects through doing things with people rather than being with people, Victoria said. Some kids are like that. Some people are like that. She said it with the slight detachment of someone describing a phenomenon they recognized personally and had thought about before. Yeah, he said. Maybe. There's a junior 4-H program in Millhaven, Victoria said. She'd apparently looked this up at some point. Plant science and small animal care. It meets on Saturday mornings. Jason looked at her. You research the local 4-H? I do due diligence on things, she said without apology. It might be nothing, but if she's more engaged when her hands are involved. He thought about Sophie reorganizing the market table, Sophie examining Mabel with the thoroughness of a small veterinarian, Sophie asking about chickens within 20 minutes of arriving. I'll ask her, he said. He asked. Sophie said immediately, Does it have animals? Plant science and small animal care, he confirmed. I'll go once, she said. If it's bad, I'll stop. She went. It was not bad. She came home the first Saturday talking about a rabbit. Not her stuffed one, a real one, a Holland Lop belonging to a girl named Mackenzie that Sophie had apparently held for 11 minutes while its owner demonstrated proper support technique. Sophie described the rabbit in the same careful, thorough detail she applied to most things. She did not say it was fun, she said it was informative, but she went back the next Saturday and the one after that. By the middle of October, she knew Mackenzie's last name and had mentioned once that Mackenzie was okay for a person. For Sophie, this was a declaration of significant warmth. The month turned and took the last of the color with it, the big oak dropping its leaves in long rushes that Sophie watched from the kitchen window with the focused attention of someone witnessing something she'd decided was important. The farm in November had a particular stripped-down quality. The greenhouse doing its winter work, the fields bare and dark with moisture, the yard perpetually damp. Jason had grown up with this season in Oregon and barely noticed it anymore. Sophie, who'd spent her life in apartments in Portland and Clover Falls, was somewhere between fascinated and unsettled by it. There's so much space, she said one afternoon, standing at the edge of the field. She said it like she hadn't decided yet if that was good or bad. Yeah, he said. He was standing beside her. Mabel was somewhere in the field, invisible, moving through the tall grass with the inefficient enthusiasm of an old dog who'd temporarily forgotten she was old. In our apartment, Sophie said, you could hear everything, the neighbors, the street, all of it, all the time. She paused. I used to think it was annoying. And now? She didn't answer right away. It was loud, she said finally, but it was company. She said it matter-of-factly, the way she delivered all the things that hurt. Then she turned and walked back toward the house, and Mabel came crashing out of the grass to follow her, tail going, and Sophie caught the old dog's face in both hands and pressed her forehead against the top of her head for a moment before letting go and going inside. Jason stood at the edge of the field alone for a while after that. He thought about all the sounds he'd gotten used to not having, the silence he'd told himself he preferred, the particular shape of a life built for one person that he'd been quietly, stubbornly certain was what he deserved. And he thought about how, in the space of 6 weeks, that silence had been completely rearranged. Not filled exactly, but altered, given texture and presence it hadn't had before. He was not okay. He was making too many mistakes, moving too slowly on the income question, still figuring out the rhythms of what Sophie needed and when. Victoria and he existed in a state of careful, provisional warmth that neither of them had named or pushed, both of them circling the question of what it was. Sophie was still hurting, every day, in the precise, controlled way she hurt everything, managing it with both hands, never letting it spill where she couldn't see it. None of it was okay in the way the word okay usually meant, but it was real. Every morning was real in a way his life had not been before the phone call. Every argument about lunch contents and every wrong turn in the 3rd grade math curriculum and every market table reorganization and every evening when Sophie fell asleep holding her rabbit with her jaw set like she was ready for whatever the night might bring, all of it was real. And real, he was finding, was the thing he hadn't known he was missing. One evening in late October, he finally called the hospital in Clover Falls about Emily's belongings. He'd been putting it off. Not forgetting, the note on his hand had become a note on a paper on the refrigerator. But putting it off, the way you put off things that are going to cost you something emotional you haven't fully budgeted for yet. The woman at the hospital was professional and kind and said yes, they did have Ms. Brooks' personal effects, and yes, he could arrange to collect them. And yes, she'd need to verify his relationship. He drove to Clover Falls on a Saturday while Sophie was at 4-H with Mackenzie and the Holland Lop. Victoria offered to come, and he said no. This was something he needed to do alone, and she accepted that without argument, which was one of the things about her he was increasingly grateful for. The belongings were in a small cardboard box. He signed for it, thanked the woman, and carried it to the truck and sat there in the parking lot for a few minutes before opening it. Inside, a phone with a dead battery and a cracked screen, a wallet, a small set of keys, 2 books, a hair tie, a photograph. Sophie, maybe 5 years old, gap-toothed and laughing at something outside the frame, and a ring, copper wire, coiled with the careful imperfection of something made by hand, worn smooth where it had sat on a finger every day. He sat with it for a long time. On the way home, he stopped at the farm supply store in town and bought a small display stand meant for jewelry. He put the ring on it when he got home and set it on Sophie's windowsill next to the plant. He said nothing about it. That evening, coming down for dinner, Sophie stopped in the doorway of her room for a moment. He heard her go back in. He heard her stand there. Then she came down to dinner and sat in her chair and put her rabbit on the adjacent chair and looked at her plate. "Thank you," she said, quietly, without looking up. "Sure," he said. And that was all. But for the rest of that evening, something was different in the house. Not better in any simple way, not fixed, nothing like that. Just different, like a pressure that had been sitting somewhere at the edge of everything had shifted slightly, moved an inch in a direction that wasn't away. Victoria caught his eye across the dinner table. He looked at her. She held his gaze for just a moment, and then she looked away, and he looked away. And they ate dinner, and the rain came back on the roof the way it always did, like it had nowhere better to be. November came in hard. Not dramatically. No single storm, no event that announced itself. Just the slow, grinding arrival of a cold that had teeth in it, settling into the valley around Millhaven, the way cold does in Oregon Hill Country, getting into the walls of old farmhouses and staying there. Jason had done what he could before it arrived. Winterized the greenhouse, replaced the weather stripping on the back door, had the furnace serviced by a man named Walt, who'd been servicing furnaces in the county for 30 years and communicated primarily in sighs. Walt sighed at the age of the furnace. He sighed at the state of the ducts. He sighed at Jason's decision to wait this long to call. But the furnace ran. Sophie had been living on the farm for just under 2 months by the time the temperature dropped below freezing for the first time. She'd acquired, in that time, a routine that was entirely her own. Not one Jason had designed for her, but one she'd constructed through trial and preference and the quiet insistence on self-determination that defined everything she did. She got up at 6:50. She made her own breakfast, usually cereal or toast, occasionally attempting something more ambitious that sometimes worked and sometimes produced results. She ate anyway out of sheer stubbornness. She was ready for school 8 minutes before Jason came to tell her it was time. She had also, somewhere in the last 2 weeks of October, stopped taking her rabbit to school. She still kept him on her pillow every night, but the morning departure now involved setting him carefully against the wall beside the pillow, a deliberate repositioning that Jason understood to mean she'd decided she didn't need the backup anymore, or at least that she needed people to believe she didn't. What she had not done in 2 months was cry. Not once. Not where he could see it. He thought about that a lot. Victoria had been back to Portland twice, once for 2 days, once for a long weekend, for meetings she couldn't handle remotely. Each time she'd told Jason her schedule in advance, factual and organized, and each time she'd come back without being asked to, which he registered without commenting on. Sophie registered it too. The second time Victoria returned, she came in the door and put her bag down, and Sophie looked at her from the kitchen table and said, "You smell like the city," which in Sophie's particular vocabulary was an observation, not a criticism. "Does the city smell bad?" Victoria said. "Different," Sophie said, "like exhaust and coffee and something else." She paused. "I used to like it." "You might again," Victoria said. Sophie considered this. "Maybe," she said, in the tone she used when she wasn't conceding anything but was leaving a door open. These were the increments. Small, sometimes almost invisible, but Jason had learned to track them the way you track weather. Not looking for one definitive sign, but reading the accumulated pressure of small indicators over time. Sophie was slowly, grudgingly, allowing the farm to become familiar. She was slowly, grudgingly, allowing Jason to become someone other than a stranger she'd decided in advance to be suspicious of. She was even, in the careful way she'd begun to sit near Victoria in the evenings, allowing something that might eventually become attachment, if nothing broke it first. What broke it was a Wednesday in the second week of November, 6 days after the cold arrived in earnest. Sophie came home from school different. Jason was in the greenhouse when the bus dropped her off, and he saw her through the glass panels walking up the drive, her backpack higher on her shoulders than usual, her chin tucked, her pace too controlled. He recognized the posture. He'd seen versions of it before, mostly in the first weeks, but she'd been moving away from it lately. Seeing her carry it now made something in him tighten. He came out of the greenhouse. "Hey," he said. She looked at him briefly. "Hey." She kept walking toward the house. "How was school?" "Fine." She went inside. He gave her 20 minutes. He'd learned this. Sophie needed a buffer between the end of school and being asked about it, needed the decompression of her room and her rabbit, and the particular silence of the house in the late afternoon before she was ready to have a conversation that meant anything. He went back to the greenhouse, finished what he was doing, came inside at the end of the 20 minutes. He knocked on her bedroom door. "You hungry? I was going to make something early." A pause. "I'm not hungry." "Okay." He waited. "You want to talk about anything?" Another pause, longer. "No." He stood at the door for a moment, then, "Mackenzie, say something." He knew from experience that the most precise pain at 7 came from the people you'd decided to trust. The door opened. Sophie stood in the doorway with her rabbit and looked at him with an expression that had given up on being flat. Her eyes were red at the edges in the way eyes get when someone has been crying somewhere private, and then stopped, and then started again. and then stopped again. Her mom asked about my mom, she said. At pickup, in front of everyone. In front of... What did she ask? She said, "Oh, you're the girl whose mother died. That's so sad." Sophie delivered it in a measured, careful voice. Then her jaw set hard. In front of everyone, like it was something that happened to someone in a story, not... She stopped. Not like it was my mom. He didn't say anything immediately, didn't rush to fix it or minimize it. He just stood there and let her have the full weight of it for a moment, which he'd learned was what she actually needed, even if it felt to him like doing nothing. That was a careless thing to say, he said finally. She didn't mean it bad, Sophie said. Her voice went a little rougher. I know she didn't mean it bad. That's worse, kind of, when they don't mean it bad. Yeah, he said. It is. Sophie pressed the rabbit against her chest. Mackenzie didn't say anything. She just kind of stood there. A pause. I don't know if that's bad. That she didn't say anything. People don't always know what to do when something hard happens in front of them, he said. Even people who care. Sophie looked at him. The look had something in it that was an actual question now, not a test. Did you do that? When my mom left you? Did you just stand there? He took a slow breath. Yeah, he said. More than I should have. She absorbed this. Why? Because I was scared, he said. And because I'd convinced myself that if I waited long enough, things would sort themselves out without me having to... He stopped. Without me having to actually do anything hard. Sophie looked at him with the ancient precision that 7-year-olds occasionally produce, the kind that cuts through everything and lands exactly on the thing you'd hope to keep covered. Is that why you didn't look for us? She said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a real question, asked in a real voice, and it deserved a real answer. I didn't know to look, he said. But if I'm honest, if I had known, I'm not sure younger me would have been brave enough to show up. He looked at her steadily. I'm trying to be braver now. Sophie was quiet for what felt like a long time. She looked down at her rabbit. Her thumb moved across the worn ear in the small, habitual gesture she probably wasn't aware of. Then she looked up and said, in a voice that was very small but entirely deliberate, She kept your picture. He nodded. She kept it in a box with some other stuff, old stuff. She swallowed. She didn't talk about you, but she kept it. Another swallow. I used to think that meant something, like she still... I don't know. She stopped. The red at the edges of her eyes had gotten worse. I think it probably did mean something, he said quietly. Sophie's face crumpled. Just once, just for a second. The 7-year-old, she actually was breaking through the controlled surface of the person she'd decided she needed to be. She pressed her face into the rabbit and made a sound that she tried to muffle, one sharp, wounded sound, and then she pulled it back together with an effort that was physically visible, her shoulders squaring, her chin coming back up. He didn't reach for her. He waited to see what she needed. What she did was take one step forward and press her forehead against his arm. Not a hug, nothing that committed, but contact. The specific contact of someone who needed the physical fact of another person without being willing to call it what it was. He put his hand on the back of her head. Didn't hold her, just let her feel that his hand was there. They stood like that for maybe 30 seconds. Then she stepped back and looked at her rabbit and said, with the reconstructed flatness, I'm still not hungry. Okay, he said. Dinner's at 6 if you change your mind. She went back into her room and closed the door. He stood in the hallway and pressed the heel of his hand hard against his sternum for a moment, because the thing that was there needed somewhere to go, and he didn't have anywhere else to put it. Victoria was in the kitchen when he came downstairs. She'd heard enough to understand the shape of it, and she asked only, Is she okay? She's Sophie, he said. So, yes and no. Victoria nodded. She put water on for tea without being asked. He sat at the table. She sat across from him. The kitchen was getting dark outside the window, the early dark of November, and neither of them turned on more lights than they needed. I keep thinking I'm going to say the wrong thing, he said. With her. Like there's one wrong sentence between us right now, and she's going to... He stopped. Going to what? Victoria said. Decide I'm not worth it. Victoria looked at him levelly across the table. She already knows you might not be, she said. That's not the question she's asking. The question she's asking is whether you're going to stay anyway. He looked up. She doesn't need you to be perfect, Victoria said. She needs you to be consistent. Those are completely different things. You sound like you've thought about this before, he said. With someone other than Sophie. Victoria was quiet for a moment. She turned her mug by the handle. My father was brilliant, she said, in a tone that had been stripped clean of most of its feeling. He was also completely unable to stay in one place, emotionally, professionally, physically. He was not a bad person, he was just intermittent. You never knew when you'd get him and when you'd get the version that was somewhere else entirely. She paused. I spent a significant part of my childhood deciding I didn't need consistency, that I could build my own. Another pause. I was wrong. I just got very good at compensating for it. He looked at her. She was looking at her mug. This was, he understood, more than she typically gave, and it had been given deliberately, and he was not going to make something sentimental of it. Is that why the child welfare work? He said. She glanced up briefly. That's one of the reasons, she said. Can we leave it there for tonight? Yeah, he said. We can leave it there. The dinner happened at 6. Sophie came down at 5:58, still red-eyed but composed, and ate most of what was on her plate and said that the broccoli was overcooked, which was true and which Jason accepted as the peace offering it was. The fever came 4 days later. It started small. Sophie quieter than usual at dinner, picking at her food, claiming she wasn't tired when she clearly was. Jason put his hand to her forehead out of instinct and she pulled back automatically before registering what he was doing. And then, in the small, careful way she was learning to allow contact, she held still. She was warm. Not terrifyingly warm, but warm enough. I'm fine, she said. Probably, he said. Let's just check. The thermometer read 101.2. Not dangerous territory, but enough. He gave her children's Tylenol. They'd gotten it at the pharmacy in town last week as a precaution, another of Victoria's due diligence preparations, stocked in the cabinet with the same quiet thoroughness she brought to everything, and sent her to bed with extra water. She went without argument, which was itself a sign of how she was feeling. By morning, it was 102.7. He called the pediatrician's office in town that he'd registered her with the week after she arrived. Dr. Anisha Patel, who had a practice above the hardware store that managed to be both modest in space and somehow entirely competent. The office said to bring her in. He brought her in. Sophie sat on the crinkly paper of the examination table and answered Dr. Patel's questions with characteristic precision and was diagnosed with a respiratory infection, viral, likely, with a secondary bacterial component that warranted antibiotics. Her immune system might be responding to the new environment, Dr. Patel said to Jason, outside the room where Sophie was putting her shoes back on. New school, new region, new seasonal exposure. It's common. Keep her warm, keep her hydrated, antibiotic twice daily for 10 days. If the fever goes above 104, call me immediately. Okay, he said. She's a tough kid, Dr. Patel added, not as a comfort, but as an observation. I know, he said. Sophie spent the next 2 days in bed, which she tolerated with the resigned irritability of someone who hated being stationary. She read. She directed Mabel's position in the room with the authority of a small general. She asked Jason for tea and then specified exactly how she wanted it. Not too hot, no sugar, a small amount of honey. And he made it wrong twice before getting it right, which she informed him of directly each time. Victoria came in and out with books from the small shelf in the living room that she'd quietly supplemented over the past weeks with titles she'd ordered. She'd paid attention to what Sophie read, noted preferences, and ordered accordingly without announcing it. Sophie had noticed without saying anything, in the way she noticed most things. On the second evening, Sophie woke up at 2 a.m. Jason heard her through the baby monitor he dug out of a box in the storage room, something left behind by his grandfather's later tenants, discovered when he'd been looking for something else, kept as an instinct he hadn't examined closely. The sound was small, not crying, not a call. Just the specific sound of someone awake in the dark who didn't know what to do about it. He was at her door in under a minute. She was sitting up in bed, her rabbit in her lap, her face pale and damp with the particular sweat of a broken fever. The thermometer on the nightstand read 99.1, down from the 102.4 it had been at 11. Her eyes were glassy but aware. "Hey," he said from the doorway. "I had a dream," she said. Her voice was hoarse from the infection. "About what?" She looked at her rabbit. "About my mom's apartment, the way it smelled. She had this candle she always burned, vanilla, or something like it. I could smell it in the dream." She paused. "And then I woke up and I couldn't." She said it simply, in the stripped-down way that children sometimes describe devastation. "I couldn't smell it anymore, and I couldn't—" She stopped. He came into the room and sat on the edge of the bed, not close enough to crowd her, just present. "I'm scared I'm going to forget things," she said. Not loudly, not dramatically, just stated, the way you state things you've been carrying for a while and finally run out of room for. I keep trying to remember her voice, like exactly how it sounded, and I can hear it, kind of, but not exactly, and I don't— She pressed her lips together. "I don't want to not be able to remember exactly." He sat with that for a moment, didn't try to reassure her that she wouldn't forget, because that would be a lie, and she was a kid who could detect lies at 100 yards. "That's one of the hardest things about losing someone," he said, "that the exact details start to soften. It doesn't mean you're forgetting her. It means you're human." "I don't want to be human about it," she said. The bluntness of it was almost funny, and he thought he saw something flicker across her face that wasn't quite a smile but had its flavor. "I know," he said. "Me neither, usually." She looked at him. The lamplight was the only light. The small lamp he'd left on when he put her to bed turned low. She looked younger in it than she usually let herself look. "Did you forget things about her?" she said. "My mom, when you knew her." "I was trying to for a long time," he said honestly, "after we broke up. I wanted to forget things because remembering hurt." He paused. "But I didn't, mostly. The real things stay." "What's a real thing?" she said. He thought about Emily. He thought about the things he'd spent 7 years trying to put in a box and leave there, and the ways they'd refused to stay. The way she argued about things she cared about, he said. She never let anything go when she thought she was right. She could be incredibly frustrating about it. He paused. But it also meant that when she was on your side, she was completely on your side. That doesn't go away. Sophie was quiet. She was looking at the copper ring on its small stand by the window. He'd moved it there from the dresser last week so it caught the morning light. "She argued about the heat in our apartment for 6 months, Sophie said. The landlord kept saying he'd fix it, and she kept calling, and then she started sending letters, and then she sent one to the city." A small pause. "The heat got fixed." "That sounds like her," he said. Sophie looked at the ring a moment longer. Then she looked back at him. Something had shifted in her face. Not the armor coming down. Not entirely. But a particular stone being moved out of the wall. "Are you going to leave?" she said. "No," he said. "You can't just say no," she said, with the practicality of a kid who had thought about this carefully. "You have to say why, or it doesn't count." He looked at her, 7 years old, fever pale, rabbit in her lap, in a farmhouse in Oregon in the middle of the night, and she was making him prove his answer. He thought about what Victoria had said. Not perfect, consistent. He thought about what he'd told Sophie in the hallway about being braver now. "Because you're mine," he said. "Not because the court said so. Because you're actually mine. And I've already been someone who didn't show up, and I'm not willing to be that again." Sophie held his gaze. Measuring, he let her measure. "Okay," she said finally. Not like she fully believed it yet, but like she'd put it in the drawer with the other things she was going to examine later, and this time it was in a different stack. The one she was building toward something. "You should sleep," he said. "You want more water?" "My throat hurts," she said. "I'll get the honey tea," he said, and got up. "The right amount of honey this time," she said behind him. "I have it memorized now," he said. "You said that last time," she said. He got the tea right. She drank half of it and fell asleep with the mug still in her hands, and he took it from her without waking her and sat in the chair he'd pulled to the side of the bed and stayed there. Not because she needed him to. She was breathing fine. The fever was down. Dr. Patel had given him clear parameters, and he was within all of them. He stayed because she was his kid, and she'd said she was scared of forgetting, and he was not willing to be someone who went back to bed. He stayed until 4:30. Then he went to the kitchen and made coffee and sat at the table in the dark before the house woke up. And somewhere around 5 he heard footsteps on the stairs, and Victoria appeared in the kitchen doorway in the gray wool sweater she'd apparently been sleeping in. "She okay?" Victoria said. "Fever's down. She's sleeping." He looked at her. "You heard?" "Sound carries in this house," she said, going to the coffee maker. She poured a mug. She sat down across from him. She looked like she hadn't fully slept, which meant she'd been listening, which meant she'd been present, in the particular way she was present when she thought no one was tracking it. "You didn't have to stay up," he said. "I know," she said. She wrapped both hands around the mug. "How are you doing?" He thought about it honestly. "I'm tired," he said. He stopped, started over. "She asked me if I was going to leave." Victoria looked at him across the table. "I told her no," he said. "Did she believe you?" "Not all the way," he said. "Not yet." Victoria nodded slowly. She looked out the window. The sky was the particular dark blue that preceded light. Not quite night anymore, but not morning. "She'll get there," she said. Not as a promise, as an observation based on what she knew of Sophie. "Will she?" he said, not challenging, actually asking. Victoria looked at him. "She already moved the rabbit," she said. He blinked. "When she stopped taking it to school," Victoria said, "she repositioned it from under her arm when she slept to beside the pillow. Do you know what that means?" He shook his head slowly. "It means she's not holding it all night anymore," Victoria said. "She still wants it there, but she's not holding it." She paused. "That's not a small thing." He sat with that. The coffee was good and the kitchen was cold at the edges despite the heat running, and outside the sky was moving from dark blue toward the first pale gray of the day. He thought about 2 months ago. The courtroom, Sophie's backpack, the too small colored chair. He thought about how much had changed and how much hadn't, and how the things that hadn't changed were mostly in him, the things he was still working on. "Victoria," he said. She looked at him. "I want to say something, and I need you to let me say it without—" He stopped. "Without you deciding what it means before I finish." She waited. "I'm glad you're here," he said. "Not glad you agreed. Not glad you helped with the legal thing. I mean here. In this kitchen at 5 in the morning, I'm glad you're this version of here." She held his gaze. Her expression did the thing it sometimes did, the complex private movement that she usually closed off quickly. This time she let it sit for a moment before it settled. "Okay," she said finally. Quiet. "That's all," he said. "That's the whole thing." She looked back at her coffee. "Okay," she said again, slightly differently. He didn't push it further. He'd learned that with her too, that okay could contain a lot of weight depending on which way she was holding it, and this one had more in it than she was ready to say out loud. Sophie recovered by the end of the week. She came downstairs on Friday morning with her color back and her appetite returned, and her manner its usual combination of independent and watchful. She ate a full breakfast and requested that he stop making the oatmeal because she'd decided she was done with oatmeal, possibly forever, and he said, "Okay," and she moved on. At 4-H on Saturday, Mackenzie was there with the Holland Lop. Sophie came home and told Jason, without being asked, that Mackenzie had said sorry about her mom at school. Not by saying sorry exactly, by saving her a seat at lunch without making a thing of it, and by sharing her chips without comment, which, according to Sophie, was actually better than saying it. "She knows you now," Jason said. "Sort of," Sophie said. "She's figuring me out." She paused. "I'm figuring her out too." The 60-day evaluation fell on a Wednesday in early December. It was not Linda Cho this time, but Sandra Okafor herself, which meant the legal weight was heavier. She arrived in the morning, professional and contained, and did what she did. Walked the house, asked her questions, reviewed the documentation Jason had prepared, He'd put together a folder: school enrollment and attendance records, Sophie's last 2 report cards forwarded from Clover Falls, a log he'd been keeping of doctor's appointments and medication schedules and school events and 4-H sessions. He'd started the log on instinct and kept it because it helped him stay organized, and now, sitting across from Sandra Okafor while she reviewed it, he understood it was also evidence. Sandra looked at the log. She looked at the school records. She looked at the letter from Dr. Patel about Sophie's recent illness and treatment and recovery. She looked at the letter from Ms. Aldridge at school, which said, in careful professional language, that Sophie was performing above grade level, was beginning to form peer connections, and that while she continued to show signs of processing grief, she was doing so in a healthy and supported manner. Then Sandra asked to speak to Sophie. He sent Sophie in from the hallway. He and Victoria waited in the kitchen. Victoria had her laptop open but wasn't looking at it. He had his coffee and was doing the same. 15 minutes passed. 20. At 25, Sophie came out with her rabbit. She'd brought it down this morning, unusual for a school day, and he'd said nothing, and walked past him into the kitchen and climbed onto her chair. Sandra Okafor followed. She sat down at the table across from Jason. "She's adjusting," Sandra said. "She's honest about the difficulty. She told me she still has hard days. She told me she's not entirely sure about things yet." A pause. "She also told me," Sandra paused briefly, "that the farm smells right now, that it smells like it belongs to people." Jason looked at his coffee cup. "I'm going to recommend continuation of temporary guardianship, with a pathway toward permanent consideration at the 6-month mark," Sandra said. "I want continued monthly check-ins through the spring. Sophie will remain assigned her court advocate through at least the first permanent determination." She looked at him. The advocate's last report was positive. "Okay," he said. Sandra looked at Sophie, who was listening without pretending not to. "I'm going to ask you one thing," she said to Sophie directly, "and I want your real answer. Are you safe here?" Sophie looked at Jason, then at Victoria, then at Sandra Okafor. She held the rabbit in her lap. She took a measured breath the way she took measured breaths when she was deciding how much truth to give. "Yes," she said. "I'm safe." "Is there anything you need that you're not getting?" Sandra said. Sophie thought about it with genuine consideration. "I want chickens," she said. "He said there was room." Jason said nothing. Sandra Okafor looked at Sophie for a moment, and then something crossed her face that was not quite a smile, but was in close proximity to one. "I'll let you two work that out," she said. She gathered her folder. She stood. She looked at Jason. "Mr. Carter?" A pause. "You're doing better than I expected." He wasn't entirely sure how to take that, so he just said, "Thank you." She left. Sophie watched the door close. She turned to look at Jason. "Does that mean yes on the chickens?" she said. "That means we'll talk about it," he said. "That means yes," she said. He looked at Victoria. Victoria looked at her coffee and said nothing, which was its own kind of agreement. Sophie seemed to take it as confirmation and nodded decisively and went back to her breakfast. The farm in December was a different creature. The cold proper now, frost on the greenhouse glass in the mornings, the fields silver and still. Jason had picked up the distribution contract he'd been working toward, a regional produce supplier in Portland who wanted specialty greens and early season starts through the winter and spring. It wasn't a fortune. It was enough to matter, which was what he needed it to be. The first delivery was on a Tuesday, and he drove it in himself 60 miles to Portland and back. And on the way home, he called Dan Reyes and told him. And Dan said, "About damn time," in the warm way Dan said most things. The farm was starting to work. Not easily. Not without the constant low-level anxiety of small-margin agriculture in a wet Oregon winter. But it was working, and the working of it was something he could point to. Something solid in a life that had been very short on solid things 6 months ago. He came home from the Portland run to find Sophie in the kitchen attempting to make soup. She had found a recipe on an old cookbook he kept on the shelf, say, the one his grandmother had given him, falling apart at the spine, and had assembled most of the ingredients on the counter in the organized manner of someone who had decided this was a project and was approaching it accordingly. There was soup stock everywhere. The counter had flour on it for reasons that were unclear given that the soup recipe did not call for flour. Mabel was positioned alertly near the stove. "What happened in here?" he said. "I'm making soup," Sophie said without looking up from the pot. "I spilled the stock a little." "A little," he said, looking at the counter. "I'm cleaning it up when I'm done," she said, with the preemptive firmness of someone who had anticipated this comment. He looked at the stove. The soup was actually simmering. It smelled reasonably good. He recognized the vegetables, carrots, an onion, and something green. He looked at the cookbook, open on the counter. She'd followed it. Her finger marks were on the page. "Need help?" he said. "I'm okay," she said. Then, after a pause, "You can stir it if you want. I have to deal with the flour." He stirred the soup while she cleaned up the flour, which she did efficiently and without complaint. Victoria came in from her office and stopped in the doorway and looked at the kitchen and its current state and then at Jason, who raised one shoulder in a small shrug. "There was flour," Sophie said preemptively. "I can see that," Victoria said. She came in and got a glass of water and leaned against the counter and watched them. "How does it smell?" "Like soup," Sophie said, "which is what it is." The soup was slightly oversalted and the carrots were a bit soft, but it was edible, and Sophie ate 2 bowls of it with the focused satisfaction of someone experiencing a significant personal achievement. Jason ate his without comment on the salt. Victoria said it was better than she expected, which Sophie received as the compliment it was. After dinner, they sat at the kitchen table. Jason had a farm supply catalog he was going through. Victoria was doing something on her laptop. Sophie had her library book. She'd gotten a library card within the first week, one of the things she'd done entirely on her own, walking in and asking the librarian without prompting. The kitchen was warm. The furnace was running without complaint. Outside, the first real frost of winter was putting itself across the fields in the dark. At some point, Sophie put her book down and looked at the 2 of them for a moment. Neither of them doing anything in particular, both of them simply there, occupied, present. The look lasted longer than she probably intended it to. Jason caught it from the edge of his vision and didn't make anything of it, just held still. "I want to name the chickens," Sophie said. Jason looked up from the catalog. "When we get them," she said. "I want to name them myself." "They're your chickens," he said. She picked her book back up, turned the page. "Okay," she said, with the particular lightness of someone who had gotten a thing she needed and was not going to make a production of it. The catalog went back to the table. Victoria's typing resumed. Sophie read. Mabel snored somewhere in the vicinity of the heating vent. The frost settled in over the fields. The farmhouse held its heat, and the 3 of them sat in the kitchen in the ordinary, imperfect, necessary way that people sit together when they are becoming, without quite having decided to, something that resembles a family. The chickens arrived in February. Not dramatically, not as a grand gesture. Jason had driven to a small poultry operation 20 miles outside Millhaven on a Saturday morning while Sophie was at 4-H and come back with 6 Rhode Island Reds in a ventilated crate in the truck bed. And when Sophie came home that afternoon, she walked into the yard and heard them from the direction of the coop he'd been building in January. Quietly. A weekend project he'd done in pieces without announcing it. And she stopped walking and looked at him. "Right now," she said. "Right now," he said. She went to the coop at something close to a run, which was the fastest he'd seen her move voluntarily in 4 months. The 6 hens were in various states of adjustment to their new environment, doing the particular anxious shuffle of birds in unfamiliar territory. Sophie crouched in front of the wire and looked at them with the focused intensity she applied to things she'd decided mattered. "That one," she said, pointing to a hen in the corner that appeared to be having a more difficult adjustment than the others, pacing with determined agitation, "is Marge." "Okay," he said. She named all 6 in under 3 minutes. Marge, Patricia, Sue, Dolores, Bev, and Carol. All of them, Jason noticed, names that belonged to women with strong opinions. He did not comment on this. Victoria came out from the house to see what the noise was. She stood beside Jason and looked at Sophie, crouching in front of the coop, conducting introductions. "Marge looks unstable," Victoria said. Sophie identified that immediately, Jason said. Of course she did. Victoria watched Sophie for a moment. "She's going to want to name the next thing we get." "There isn't a next thing," Jason said. Victoria looked at him. There's always a next thing, she said. You have 12 acres. He looked at the fields. He looked at the coop. He looked at Sophie telling Dolores that she needed to calm down. He thought about 12 acres and what they might hold eventually, and felt something that was equal parts terror and possibility, which was becoming his standard state. Winter in Oregon is not one clean season. It breaks and returns and breaks again, teasing at spring before retreating, sometimes several times over. February gave them a week of false warmth in which the greenhouse work jumped ahead of schedule and the fields started showing the first underground movement of things coming back. Then a cold front in the third week knocked it all back and brought ice on the road and a burst pipe in the back bathroom that Jason dealt with at 6 in the morning in wet socks while Sophie watched from the doorway with her arms crossed and an expression that said she found this informative. There's water on the floor, she said. I know there's water on the floor, he said, his head under the cabinet. A lot of water, she said. Sophie. I'm just noting it. He got the pipe temporarily patched, called a plumber, spent 4 hours dealing with the fallout. Victoria, who had been on a call in the other room, emerged afterward and looked at the state of the back bathroom, and then at Jason, who was sitting on the kitchen floor with wet socks and a wrench he no longer needed. Give me that, she said, meaning the wrench. She took it, put it on the counter, filled a glass of water, and handed it to him. The plumber coming today? Tomorrow earliest, he said. Okay. She sat down across from him on the floor, which surprised him. She was wearing good clothes, work clothes from the call, and she sat down on the kitchen floor across from him and leaned her back against the cabinet. The call went over, she said. State Education Committee. They're stalling on the matching funds. Again? He said. Third time. She pulled one knee up and looked at the ceiling. I'm going to have to go to the Capitol. Make noise in person. She paused. I hate making noise in person. You're good at it, he said. Being good at something and liking it are different things, she said. She looked at him. I'll need to be in Salem for 2 days, possibly 3. He nodded. When? Next week, likely. A pause. Is that okay? He registered that she was asking, not informing, asking. Yeah, he said. Of course. She looked at him steadily for a moment. I keep thinking about the document, she said. The attorney's document. The agreement about what happened if things changed. He'd signed it in October, put it in a folder, hadn't thought about it much since. What about it? He said. I told my attorney last week to hold it, she said. Not to do anything with it, not to cancel it, just hold it. He held her gaze. Okay, he said, carefully. That's not a decision, she said immediately. I want to be clear, it's not a decision, it's just… She stopped, looked at the ceiling again. I'm not ready to make decisions about things I don't fully understand yet. That's fair, he said. I don't want you to make it into something it isn't, she said. I'm not, he said. But Victoria… He waited until she looked at him. You're sitting on my kitchen floor in good clothes after a 4-hour state committee call. I think you already made at least one decision. She held his gaze. The particular complex movement happened across her face, the thing she usually closed off. She let it sit for 3 full seconds before she looked away. Your socks are still wet, she said. That's going to be a problem. I know, he said. Go change your socks, she said. He went and changed his socks. When he came back, she was standing at the counter making tea, and neither of them said anything more about documents or decisions, and it was somehow the most honest conversation they'd had. The Salem trip happened the following week, 3 days, as predicted. Jason and Sophie managed the farm and the school run, and Marge's continued instability without significant incident. Sophie made dinner on the second night. An attempt at pasta with a homemade sauce that required more cleanup than the soup had, but that was genuinely good, better than the soup, which Sophie acknowledged by saying, I think I'm getting better at this. You are, Jason said. Mom was bad at it, Sophie said. She said it without the tightness it had once carried. Not easy, not something that had stopped hurting, but said in the way things can be said when you've decided to hold them differently. She tried, though. She really tried. I know, he said. Sophie twirled pasta on her fork with deliberate focus. I've been thinking, she said, in the tone that meant she'd been thinking for a while and had decided to let him in on it, about why she didn't tell you. He went still, set his fork down quietly, let her lead. I think she was scared, Sophie said. Not of you, just scared that it wouldn't work, that she'd tell you and you'd come for a while and then leave again. She paused. She didn't want me to have someone leave. He sat with the weight of that. I understand why she thought that, he said finally. I know you do, Sophie said. I think she was wrong, though. She said it plainly, not as comfort, as assessment. I think she should have told you and let it be what it was. She looked at him, but I also think she was doing her best. She was, he said. She absolutely was. Sophie ate more pasta. Victoria texted me, she said, shifting in the way she shifted when she'd finished with something heavy and needed to move. She said the state committee is being annoying. They are, Jason said. She said she's being louder, Sophie said. Like I told her. She said it with quiet satisfaction. He almost laughed. You told her to be louder in October. And she listened, Sophie said. Eventually. Victoria came back from Salem on a Thursday evening with the beginning of a headache and a tentative commitment from the committee for 60% of the matching funds, which was not what she'd asked for, but was more than zero, which was what they'd been offering. She came in the door and Sophie said, Did you win? And Victoria said, Partially. And Sophie said, Partial is fine if you keep going. And Victoria looked at Sophie for a moment with an expression that was unguarded in a way she didn't usually allow in the kitchen with the lights on. I'll keep going, Victoria said. Good, Sophie said, and went back to her book. Victoria put down her bag and looked at Jason, who was at the stove. He handed her a cup of tea without ceremony, and she took it and sat at the table and exhaled in the specific way of someone whose whole body has been braced for days and is finally permitted to unbrace. He did not say anything about the expression she'd had, looking at Sophie. He stored it in the same place he stored other things he understood he wasn't supposed to name yet. March arrived with the first real warmth. The greenhouse output increased. The distribution contract held. He'd picked up a second account, a restaurant in Portland that wanted specialty greens for their spring menu, a smaller volume than the distributor, but a better margin. He was still not profitable in any comfortable sense, but the numbers were moving in a direction that felt like intent rather than luck. He also got the call from the county clerk's office confirming that paternity testing, initiated through Sandra Okafor's office in December, had returned the results he'd known they would return. Sophie Brooks was his biological daughter. He held the paperwork for a long time, sitting at the kitchen table in the late afternoon light of an early March day. It was not surprising. It confirmed nothing he hadn't already known. But there was something about seeing it on paper, the word confirmed beside his name and hers, that undid something in him in a way he hadn't prepared for. He was still sitting at the table when Sophie came home from school. She dropped her backpack on the hook and came to the kitchen and looked at him and looked at the paper. "What's that?" she said. "Paternity confirmation," he said, "from the court. Official paperwork that says I'm your biological father." She looked at the paper, then at him. Her face did something complicated. "We already knew that," she said. "Yeah," he said. "So why do you look like that?" she said. "Because knowing something and having it written down are different things," he said. She appeared to find this reasonable. She picked up the paper and looked at it seriously. She turned it over as though checking for additional information on the back. Then she set it down. "Okay," she said. Then, "Mackenzie's rabbit had babies." He blinked. "What?" "5 of them," she said. "She texted me. She said I could have one if I wanted." She looked at him with the particular expression she used when she decided the answer was yes, and was waiting for him to arrive at the same conclusion. "The chickens have a lot of space in the coop." "Rabbits don't live in coops," he said. "They can live near the coop," she said. He looked at the paternity confirmation sitting on the table between them. He looked at his daughter. "I'll build a hutch," he said. Sophie nodded decisively. "It's a Holland lop," she said. "Like Mackenzie's. It'll be small." "Okay," he said. She went to get a snack and he sat with the paper in the late afternoon light, and the sound of Marge causing some kind of disturbance in the coop outside, and thought about how 4 months ago he hadn't known her name. The spring evaluation, the one that Sandra Okafor had said would carry more weight than the 60-day assessment, was scheduled for the first week of April. Jason had known it was coming since December. He'd been preparing for it in the way he prepared for most things, practically in pieces, not all at once, because looking at the whole thing was too much. He'd kept the log. He'd maintained the school records. He'd made sure Sophie's therapy sessions with Dr. Ramos, a therapist in town who Sandra had recommended and who Sophie had initially resisted and then, gradually, begun to use the way she used everything she found useful with focused intent and on her own terms, were documented. Dr. Ramos had told Jason, in their one brief meeting in February, that Sophie was processing her grief in a healthy manner, that she was a remarkably self-aware child, and that she was beginning to develop what the doctor called secure attachment behaviors with the adults in her life. Jason had asked what that meant, practically. Dr. Ramos had said, "She's starting to reach for people, not because she has to, because she wants to." He'd thought about that a lot. The week before the evaluation, something happened that he hadn't planned for. Victoria's mother called. He didn't know Victoria had a complicated relationship with her mother until he heard Victoria's voice change in the hallway. Not dramatically, just a specific flattening that he'd come to recognize as the thing she did when she was deploying her composure against something that required effort to hold. He was in the kitchen. Sophie was at school. The conversation went on for 20 minutes, and when Victoria came into the kitchen, she set her phone face down on the counter and stood at the window with her arms crossed and said nothing for a moment. "Do you want coffee?" he said. "No," she said. Then, "Yes." She turned around. "My mother wants to meet Sophie." He set a mug down carefully. "Okay." "I said I would discuss it with you," she said, "which I've now done by telling you." She picked up the coffee. "I have not agreed to anything." "Why not?" he said. Victoria looked at him. "Because my mother has a very particular way of looking at situations she doesn't understand," she said. "And this situation," she gestured vaguely at the kitchen, at the farm, at the general sum of everything. "She has questions." "What kind of questions?" Victoria was quiet for a moment, deciding how much to say. "She wants to know why I married someone she'd never heard of, in under 12 hours, in order to help him get custody of a child that isn't biologically mine." She paused. "She has framed these concerns more diplomatically, but that's the substance." "That's a fair set of questions," Jason said. "Yes," Victoria said. "It is. It's also—" She stopped. "My mother's version of fair questions involves a particular tone that I find—" She pressed her lips together. She would look at this and see a man who called me at 1 a.m. with a desperate situation and a convenient proposal, and she would not be wrong about the sequence of events. "She'd be wrong about what it is now," he said. Victoria looked at him. "I know that," she said. "I'm not sure I can explain it to her in a way she'd accept." "Maybe she doesn't have to accept it," he said. "Maybe she just has to see it." Victoria held his gaze. "You want me to bring her here?" "I'm not telling you what to do," he said. "I'm saying that if she came here and spent a few hours in this kitchen with Sophie and with us, she'd understand something she can't understand from a phone call." Victoria was quiet. She turned her coffee mug by the handle, the small rotation he'd come to know as her thinking gesture. "Sophie would have opinions about that," she said finally. "Sophie has opinions about everything," he said. That got a brief, genuine laugh out of her, small but real. "She does," she said, then quieter. "I'll think about it." Her mother came the following Sunday. Her name was Catherine Sinclair, tall, composed, with Victoria's bone structure and a manner that was courteous in the thorough, slightly chilly way of someone who had learned courtesy as a survival skill. She arrived in a rented car and came into the farmhouse and looked around with eyes that missed nothing and a face that gave nothing back. Victoria was at her most controlled. Jason was himself, which meant he was not particularly smooth, which he'd decided was probably fine. Sophie looked at Catherine from across the kitchen table for approximately 30 seconds and then said, "You look like Victoria." "Victoria looks like me," Catherine said. "I was first." Sophie appeared to find this an acceptable response. "Are you staying for lunch?" she said. "If I'm invited," Catherine said. "You're invited," Sophie said, which was both more than Jason had expected and exactly Sophie. She turned to Jason. "We should make the soup," she said. "My soup, not the jar one." "Okay," he said. They made the soup together, he and Sophie, with Catherine watching from the table, and Victoria making herself useful with bread that she heated in the oven, which was her standard contribution to meals, and which Sophie had come to accept as Victoria's particular domestic capability. Sophie narrated the cooking process with the organized thoroughness of someone who'd decided that demonstrating competence was the correct approach to a new audience. She explained the vegetables, the stock, the amount of salt, and why. She mentioned briefly that she'd learned to not oversalt by oversalting the first time and being told about it by Victoria. "She didn't yell," Sophie said. "She just said, 'More than this next time means less,' which made sense." Catherine looked at Victoria. Victoria was looking at the bread. Her expression was unreadable in its particular way. Over lunch, Catherine asked Sophie careful questions about school, about the farm, about the chickens, about Mackenzie. Sophie answered with her characteristic combination of precision and self-possession. She did not perform for Catherine. She just talked, the way she talked when she'd decided someone was worth talking to, which was its own kind of compliment. At one point, Catherine asked Sophie gently, "Do you like it here?" Sophie considered this with genuine thought. "I didn't at first," she said honestly. Everything was different, and I was really sad." She said it flatly, the grief held at arm's length enough to be stated plainly. "But it smells right here now. And I know where things are." She paused. "And he doesn't leave." She didn't look at Jason when she said it. She was looking at her soup bowl. But the words landed in the room with full weight and stayed there. Catherine looked at Jason across the table. Her expression had shifted, not warmly exactly, but by a degree. The particular degree of someone who has had a question answered by something they didn't expect. She looked at Victoria. Something passed between them that was too old and too private for him to read. After lunch, Catherine walked the property with Jason. Victoria and Sophie stayed at the house. Sophie showing Victoria something on the tablet that had become a weekend fixture. Catherine walked beside him with her hands in her coat pockets, looking at the fields, at the greenhouse, at the coop where Marge was conducting whatever personal drama she had today. "She said he doesn't leave," Catherine said. "She said it," he said. Catherine was quiet for a moment. "Victoria doesn't talk about what this is," she said. "She describes it practically, the legal arrangement, the timeline, the child's needs." A pause. "She doesn't describe what it is." "I know," he said. "Do you know what it is?" she said. Not unkindly, directly. He thought about answering strategically. He decided against it. "I know what I hope it is," he said. "I'm not certain Victoria's at the same point yet. That's something we're still figuring out." Catherine looked at him. "My daughter doesn't do things by accident," she said. "She didn't marry you by accident. She's still here by accident." She paused. "She has been very strategic her whole life, for good reason." Another pause. "I would like to believe this is different." "So would I," he said. Catherine walked a few more steps, looked at the greenhouse. "You're going to make the farm work?" she said. "Yes," he said. "You sound certain." "I am," he said. "I wasn't for a long time, but I am now." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded, once, and turned back toward the house. Not warmth exactly, not approval in any simple form, but something had shifted, and they both knew it, and neither of them made more of it than it was. Catherine left after 3. Sophie walked her to the car, which no one had asked her to do. She stood by the driver's side window while Catherine settled in, and Catherine rolled it down. "Will you come back?" Sophie said. Catherine looked at her. "Would you like me to?" she said. Sophie thought about it with her usual seriousness. "You ask real questions," she said. "Most adults don't, so yes." Catherine looked at Sophie for a moment. Then she said very quietly, "I'll come back." She drove down the gravel drive. Sophie watched until the car was out of sight, Then she turned and went back inside. Jason and Victoria were standing on the porch. "She's okay," Sophie said. "High praise," Victoria said. "I mean it," Sophie said, and went inside. Victoria stood on the porch and watched the empty gravel drive for a moment. Jason stood beside her. The afternoon was that particular Oregon spring quality. Cool air, warm light, the two of them arriving in the same moment from opposite sides and meeting somewhere in the middle. She didn't say anything. He didn't say anything. After a while, she went inside too. The formal evaluation came on a Tuesday. Sandra Okafor arrived with the court-appointed advocate, a retired social worker named Gerald, who had a gentle, watchful manner and the capacity to be very still, which Sophie seemed to respond to better than she responded to people who filled every silence. Gerald had met with Sophie twice before, at school and once at the farm, and he and Sophie had developed what seemed from the outside like a mutual understanding based primarily on their shared appreciation of getting to the point. The evaluation proceeded the way these things did: methodical, documented, careful. Jason produced the log, the records, the letters. Sandra Okafor and Gerald walked the house. Gerald spent time with Sophie in the living room while Jason and Victoria and Sandra sat in the kitchen and talked through the last 6 months in the framework of the court's requirements. "The distribution contract," Sandra said. "That started when?" "December. Second account came in February." "Income trajectory?" "Not comfortable," he said. "I won't pretend it is, but it's moving. I can show you the last 3 months of figures." She looked at them, made notes. "Victoria's financial contribution to the household," she said. "She pays a third of the household expenses," Jason said. "We worked it out in November. It's documented." "Voluntarily," Victoria said. "Not because the arrangement required it." Sandra made a note. She looked at Victoria. "Your long-term intentions regarding this household," she said. "Not accusatory. Clinical." Victoria didn't flinch from it. "I'm here," she said. "That's my answer. I know that's not a legal commitment, and I know it's not the most satisfying answer for a court evaluation. But I'm not going to tell you I'm staying forever when neither of us can know that. What I can tell you is that I'm not leaving because it's inconvenient. I'm not here because it's convenient. I'm here because—" She paused. The pause was short, but real. "Because these are my people," she said. "I didn't expect that. But it's what's true." Sandra looked at her for a moment. Then she wrote something. Long. He couldn't read it from across the table. Gerald came out of the living room after 40 minutes. Sophie came out behind him, carrying a cup of tea she'd made for herself without being asked, which meant the conversation had gone long enough that she'd needed something to do with her hands. Gerald sat down. He folded his hands on the table. He was a man who understood the weight of what he was about to say and carried it accordingly. "Sophie is one of the more self-aware children I've assessed in 30 years of this work," he said. He said it plainly, not as flattery. "She is also one of the most deliberately self-protective. She knows the difference between what she feels and what she chooses to show, and she's developed that skill as a response to loss." He paused. "What I'm seeing compared to October is that the gap between those two things is smaller. She's showing more. Not to everyone, selectively, carefully, in the way that healthy attachment actually develops. But more." Sandra was writing. "She told me something," Gerald said. He looked at Jason. "She said she's still angry sometimes, about the years that we're missing. She said she hasn't decided yet whether she's going to stay angry about it or put it somewhere else." He paused. "She said, and I'm quoting here, 'I'm keeping the option open.'" Jason almost smiled. "She also said," Gerald looked at his notes, "that she trusts this place. She was specific about that distinction. Not everything, not yet, but this place, the farm, the people in it." The room was quiet. "My recommendation," Gerald said, "is a continuation of temporary guardianship with a formal recommendation for permanent custody determination at the 1-year mark. This is the strongest assessment I'm able to give at this stage without the permanent determination itself." He looked at Jason. "You should receive the official paperwork from the court within 10 days. I don't anticipate any significant complications." "Thank you," Jason said. After Sandra and Gerald left, Sophie stood in the kitchen doorway eating an apple and looking at the two of them. "Well?" she said. "It went well," Jason said. "They're recommending we continue." "I know that," Sophie said. "Gerald already told me." She took another bite of apple. "I mean, how are you?" It took him a second to register that she'd asked. He stopped. "Relieved," he said. "Mostly relieved." "Okay," she said. She looked at Victoria. "You okay?" "Yes," Victoria said. Her voice was quiet but steady. Sophie nodded. She finished her apple. She dropped the core in the compost bin that she'd established as a household requirement in January, and that both Jason and Victoria had, without discussion, simply adopted. She looked out the kitchen window at the coop. "Dolores is acting weird," she said. "I think she's going to lay more." "She's been laying steadily," Jason said. "This is different," Sophie said, with the authority of someone who had been watching Dolores for 2 months and had developed opinions. She pulled on her jacket and went out to check on Dolores. Victoria stood at the counter. Jason stood at the table. The afternoon light came through the kitchen window at the low angle that meant it was getting toward evening. It was warm enough that the window was cracked, and the smell of the fields came through. Wet dirt and cut grass, and something underneath it all that was just spring, just the specific smell of things that had survived the winter and were now making their case for continuing. She asked how we were, Jason said. "I heard," Victoria said. 4 months ago she wouldn't have asked that, he said. "I know," Victoria said. He looked at her. She was looking at the window, at Sophie crouching outside the coop, talking to Dolores in a low, steady voice the way she talked to all of them. Her expression was the open one, the one she let out when she thought she wasn't being watched, and occasionally, more often lately, when she knew she was. He went and stood beside her at the window. They watched Sophie negotiate with Dolores, who was clearly unconvinced by whatever case Sophie was making, but was at least listening. "When I was 7, Victoria said quietly, not looking away from the window, "I had a plant in my room. My mother had given it to me. Little succulent in a terracotta pot." She paused. "My father forgot to water it while she was traveling. It died." Another pause. "I didn't tell either of them. She stopped. "I took care of it after it was dead for about a week, watered it, put it in the sun, hoping it would come back." She shook her head slightly. "It didn't, obviously. But I kept doing it because it was something to do, something to take care of." He waited. "Sophie takes care of things," she said. "The chickens, Mabel, the compost. She's doing what I was doing at her age, making herself responsible for living things because it gives her something she can count on." "And now?" he said. Victoria looked at him. The late light was in her face. "Now I think she might be starting to count on people," she said. "Which is harder. Which is—" She stopped. "Which is what she needs." Outside, Sophie had apparently reached an understanding with Dolores, because she stood up, dusted her knees, and said something to the hen with the satisfied air of successful negotiation. Then she looked back at the kitchen window and saw them both standing there. She raised one hand in a small wave, not a child's wave, not excited, not performative, just acknowledging, just, "I see you there." Jason raised his hand back. So did Victoria. Sophie nodded once, turned back to the coop, and resumed her conversation with Patricia, who had opinions of her own about the current political situation among the 6 hens. April moved into May with the particular enthusiasm of Oregon spring unleashed, the fields going green in layers, the greenhouse running at full capacity, the New Holland lop, named Copernicus by Sophie on the grounds that he looked like he was thinking about something important, installed in his hutch near the coop, and regarded with deep suspicion by all 6 hens. Sophie managed Copernicus with the same organized thoroughness she managed everything, researching rabbit care with a library book and 2 hours on the school computer and producing a laminated feeding schedule that she posted on the hutch with a thumbtack. "You laminated it," Jason said. "So it doesn't get wet," Sophie said. "Where did you find a laminator?" "The school library," she said. "Miss Aldridge showed me." She looked at the schedule with satisfaction. "It's professional." It was, undeniably, professional. The market had picked back up with the season. Sophie was at the table most Saturdays, managing the cash box with the efficiency that had become expected by the regulars. Dora came every week for the mint and the basil, and always spoke to Sophie directly, which Sophie responded to with increasing warmth. Mackenzie sometimes came with her mother on the rare Saturdays when they weren't at 4-H, and Sophie and Mackenzie moved around each other with the specific, slightly ungraceful ease of a new friendship that was real but still finding its shape. One Saturday in late May, toward the end of the morning, a woman stopped at the table who Jason didn't recognize. Mid-50s, friendly, with the kind of openness that some people carry without effort. She looked at the display, Sophie's reorganized layout, which Jason had stopped trying to adjust, and then at Sophie, who was counting change. "These your starts?" the woman said. "His," Sophie said, nodding at Jason, "but I helped with the greenhouse in March." "Did you?" the woman said. She looked at the starts. "How's the basil this year?" "Really good," Sophie said. "He got the irrigation timing right, finally." "Sophie," Jason said. "It's true," Sophie said. The woman laughed. She bought 2 trays of basil and a bunch of thyme. As she was leaving, she said to Jason, "Your daughter's a natural salesperson." "She is," he said. He looked at Sophie, who had heard and was making change for the next customer with the focused efficiency that was her default mode. She did not look up. But her jaw, the jaw that was his jaw, did the small private thing that was Sophie's version of pleased when she'd gotten something she wanted but wasn't going to make a spectacle of wanting. He looked at that jaw. He thought about the legal pad at 1 in the morning, 11 months ago, and the photograph, and the school photo background, and the word confirmed on the paternity paper, and the way she'd pressed her forehead against his arm in the hallway and called it not a hug. He thought about all the things that had broken and bent and held and held and held. He was not done making mistakes. He knew that the way you know things you'd rather not, clearly, without comfort. He would get things wrong with Sophie in ways he hadn't yet discovered. He would get things wrong with Victoria in ways neither of them could currently predict. The farm would have bad years. Things would burst and need fixing at 6 in the morning in wet socks. That was just the substance of it. But the substance of it was real, all the way through. Every difficult, imperfect, occasionally flower-covered piece of it. The market went until noon. They loaded the truck with the empty crates and the folded table and the cash box. And Sophie climbed in the back seat with Copernicus's laminated schedule that she'd brought to show Mackenzie and then brought home again. The drive back to Millhaven was 30 minutes through the green hills. Sophie said halfway home, "Victoria's making dinner tonight." "She told you that?" Jason said. Victoria's cooking was an ongoing experiment of variable results. "She texted me," Sophie said. "She said it might be bad." "At least she's honest about it," he said. "I told her to make something simple," Sophie said. "Pasta. She can do pasta." "She cannot reliably do pasta," Jason said. "I know," Sophie said, "but I'll be there. I can fix it if she messes up." She said it without looking up from the window, watching the hills go by. That's what you do when someone's trying. He drove. The hills were very green. The truck smelled like basil and the particular good dirt that meant the season was working. In the back seat, his daughter watched Oregon go by and held the laminated schedule in her lap like a thing worth keeping, which it was, and which, like most things in his life now, he was only beginning to understand how to deserve. Victoria's pasta was, as predicted, not great. She'd overcooked it by 4 minutes. She admitted this herself, standing at the stove with the colander and an expression of someone who had miscalculated a variable and was willing to acknowledge the data. And the sauce had reduced too far, going from something promising to something with more concentration than was strictly enjoyable. Sophie arrived in the kitchen, assessed the situation without comment, added a ladle of pasta water to the sauce, and stirred it back to something workable. She did this without being asked and without making Victoria feel bad about it, which was a level of social dexterity that Jason noted and quietly marveled at. "It's better now," Sophie said, tasting it. "Because of what you did," Victoria said. "Because of what we both did," Sophie said. "You made the base. I fixed the ratio." She plated it with the matter-of-fact efficiency she brought to cooking now. "That's how it works." Victoria looked at her for a moment. Then she sat down and picked up her fork. That's how it works, she repeated quietly, to herself more than to Sophie. They ate the salvaged pasta. It was fine. Not great, but fine, which was an accurate description of a lot of things that mattered. Not the glossy version, not the thing you'd put in a photograph, but the thing you'd actually sit down with at a kitchen table on a Saturday evening in late May and eat because it was made in your kitchen by people who were yours. June arrived with the particular confidence of early Oregon summer. The cold finally retreating in earnest, the fields at their fullest, the greenhouse churning out the specialty greens that were now going to 2 accounts in Portland and a 3rd restaurant he'd added in April. Jason had run the numbers for May at the end of the month and found, for the first time, that the farm had cleared its expenses with enough margin to warrant something he hadn't used that word for in 3 years. Sustainable. Not comfortable. Not secure in any cushioned sense. But sustainable, see. The kind of arithmetic that allowed for next month and the month after that. He'd told Victoria. She'd said good, and meant it in the specific way she meant things she'd been quietly hoping for but hadn't said out loud. He'd told Sophie. She'd said, "Can we get more chickens?" "No," he'd said. "3 more," she'd said. "Just 3. "I'll think about it," he'd said. She'd nodded with the expression of someone who knew what "I'll think about it" meant when the answer wasn't no. The 1-year mark arrived in September. He'd been aware of it coming for months. Not with dread, exactly, but with the particular attention you pay to a date that has multiple meanings layered on top of each other. 1 year since the phone call. 1 year since the courthouse. 1 year since Sophie had walked into that family meeting room and looked at him with flat, measuring eyes and said, "You're him?" 1 year since Victoria had sat across from him in the cab of his truck and said, "Let's go get your daughter." It was also, by the terms of the agreement the one his attorney and Victoria's attorney had drawn up in the beginning, the one that specified a 1-year duration, the point at which the arrangement could end. He'd known that. He'd known it every day for a year, in the way you know something that's sitting in a room you're trying not to go into. And as the month of August moved through its long, warm days, and the farm hit its peak output season, and Sophie started 4th grade at Millhaven Elementary with Mackenzie already saving her a seat, Jason had begun, quietly and with difficulty, preparing himself for the conversation he'd promised himself he would have honestly. He owed her the exit. That had been the deal. He'd told her from the first phone call that she could walk away, and a person who said that and then made it complicated was a person who hadn't meant it. He was going to mean it. He chose a Sunday evening in late August. Sophie was at Mackenzie's house for a sleepover. The first one, a milestone that had involved a week of Sophie deciding she did and didn't want to go, and ultimately going with her rabbit's travel version, a smaller stuffed facsimile Mackenzie had found online and ordered as a gesture so unselfconsciously kind that Sophie had been unable to find a way to deflect it. The farm was quiet. The hens were settled. The evening light was that deep amber specific to the end of August, the last extravagant light before fall. Victoria was on the porch when he came out. She had a glass of wine and her phone face down beside her, which meant she wasn't working, which was still unusual enough to register. She looked at the fields. The big oak at the edge of the property was full and heavy with its last summer growth, throwing a shadow across the grass that reached almost to the porch. He sat down in the other chair. He'd built the second chair in February, originally a practical decision, somewhere to sit while he waited for Sophie during her outdoor projects, but now simply part of the porch, part of the shape of things. "I want to say something," he said. "Okay," she said. She didn't look at him yet. "The year's almost up," he said. "The agreement. I want to—" He stopped, found the honest version of it. "I want you to know that I mean what I said in the beginning. You can walk away. No complications. The legal stuff is already structured to make it clean. I've talked to my attorney. It can be handled quietly, and Sophie will be—" He stopped again. The next word had cost him something to locate. "Sophie will be okay," he said. "She'll be sad, but she's got enough of a foundation now that she'll be okay." Victoria was looking at the oak. The amber light was in her face. He watched her profile and waited. "You practiced that," she said. "Yes," he said. "How many times?" "3," he said. "The first 2 were worse." She almost smiled. Almost. Then she looked at him. She had the open expression, not the managed version, not the composed one, the actual one, the one that showed up when she'd decided it was allowed. "You're really going to do it," she said. "Give me the clean exit." "I said I would," he said. "I know you said you would." She held his gaze. "I'm asking if you want to." He looked at her. "No," he said. "I don't want to." "Then why are you—" "Because I meant what I said," he said. "Both things. I don't want you to go, and I'm going to give you the exit if that's what you want. Both of those things are true at the same time." Victoria was quiet for a moment. She turned her wine glass by the stem, the thinking rotation. He watched it. He'd watched it 100 times by now. He knew what it meant. "I told my attorney to cancel the document," she said. He went very still. "Not hold it," she said. "Cancel it 3 weeks ago." She paused. "I didn't tell you because I wasn't sure how to explain it in a way that wasn't—" She stopped. "In a way that wasn't more than I was ready to say." "Victoria," he said. "Don't," she said. Not harshly, just precisely. "Let me finish." She set down the wine glass. She turned to face him fully, the way she turned to face things she'd decided to address directly. "I am not a person who does things halfway. You know that. It's probably my least convenient quality." "It's one of your best ones," he said. "I'm aware," she said, with a brief dryness that was entirely her. Then she exhaled. "I came here for Sophie," she said. "That's the truth. What you said on the phone about her sitting alone in that room. That was the thing. And then I got here, and Sophie was—" She paused. "Sophie is not a child you feel sorry for. She is a child you respect. And I wasn't prepared for that. I wasn't prepared for any of—" She gestured at the farmhouse, the fields, the oak, at him. "This. I know," he said quietly. "I have spent a significant part of my adult life being very careful not to need things I couldn't guarantee keeping," she said. "My father—" "I remember," he said. Intermittent, he remembered the word. "I built everything by myself," she said. "The company, the reputation, all of it. Because if you build it yourself, you can control it. And control means it doesn't disappear on you." She paused. Her voice was steady, but he could hear what it cost to keep it that way. "And then I walked into your kitchen, and there was a 7-year-old girl who was doing exactly the same thing, building everything herself, holding it all herself, and I thought—" She stopped, looked at the oak. "I thought I know exactly where that goes." He waited. "It goes nowhere good," she said. "You build everything yourself, and you're very successful and very capable, and you sit in very expensive apartments, and you work, and you're good at it, and it's not enough." She said it plainly. Not with self-pity, which wasn't her register, just as a fact she'd arrived at and decided to state. It is not enough. The amber light was going now. The oak's shadow had reached the porch. The hens had gone quiet in the coop. All of it was just itself, just the actual physical world of the farm in the last of an August evening, not asking anything of anyone. "So I'm not going," she said. "I'm not taking the exit. I'm telling you clearly, because I know you need to hear it clearly. I'm not going anywhere, not from the farm, not from Sophie, not from—" She paused one more time. Then she let the sentence land the way it needed to. "Not from you." He looked at her. "You're sure?" he said. Not a challenge, making sure she'd heard herself. "I cancel documents when I'm sure," she said. "I told you. I don't do things halfway." He reached across and put his hand over hers where it rested on the arm of the chair. She looked at his hand. She looked at him. She did not pull back. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. It was not a scene from a movie. There were no dramatic declarations, no cinematic rainfall, no moment where everything resolved into something clean. They were two imperfect people sitting on a porch of a house that needed work, next to fields that barely broke even, having just said the truest things they knew how to say to each other, and the evening continued around them without particular ceremony, which was fine, which was actually better than fine, because real things don't need ceremony, they just need to be said. He didn't let go of her hand for a while. She didn't move it. They sat until the last of the amber light was gone and the first stars appeared over the fields. And eventually they went inside and made tea, and it was the most ordinary thing in the world, and it was exactly right. Sophie came home from Mackenzie's the next morning with a detailed account of a movie they'd watched, a strong opinion about the popcorn seasoning Mackenzie's mother had used, and 3 photographs of Copernicus's travel replica in various positions that Mackenzie had texted her. She delivered all of this in the kitchen while making herself toast, and then she looked at Jason and looked at Victoria and performed the particular stillness that meant she was reading the room. She looked at Jason's face. She looked at Victoria's. She looked at the 2 coffee cups on the table, close together. She turned back to her toast. "Finally," she said. "Sophie," Jason said. "I'm not saying anything," she said. "You just said something," he said. "I said 1 word," she said. "I'm done." She ate her toast with the composure of someone who had been patient for 11 months and was prepared to be gracious about having been right. Mabel was under the table. Copernicus was in his hutch outside. In the coop, Patricia was producing commentary about something that was probably unremarkable. It was a Monday morning in late August on a farm in Millhaven, Oregon, and it was, in every measurable way, ordinary. Jason looked at that ordinary and could not for the life of him understand how he had lived for 32 years without it. The permanent custody hearing was scheduled for the first week of October, 2 weeks past the 1-year mark. Sandra Okafor had filed her recommendation in August. Permanent custody granted to Jason Carter, with no change to the household's current structure noted as a contributing factor in the child's demonstrated stability. Gerald's final advocate report had been submitted the same week. Judge Patricia Ham, who had first looked at Jason over the rims of her reading glasses 13 months ago and told him to be readier than he thought he was, would be presiding. Jason went through the documents at the kitchen table on a Sunday night, reading them carefully. Sophie was doing homework across from him. Victoria was on her laptop in the chair by the window that had become, without any conversation about it, her chair. "Are you nervous?" Sophie said without looking up from her worksheet. "About the hearing," he said. "About everything," she said. She said it the way she said most important things. Casually, pointed at her paper, not at him. He considered the question honestly. "Yes," he said. She nodded. "Me too," she said. Then, "But not the bad kind." He looked at her. "What's the good kind?" She thought about it. "When you're nervous because something matters," she said. "Not because you're scared of losing it, because you know how much it is." She turned a page. "That's different." He looked at her for a long moment. She was 8 now. Her birthday had been in July, a farm dinner with Mackenzie and Dan Reyes and his wife and Catherine Sinclair, who had come back 3 times since her first visit, who had brought Sophie a plant, a small succulent in a terracotta pot, and who had sat at the kitchen table and talked with Sophie about naming it with the seriousness of 2 people engaged in genuinely important work. Sophie had named it Mildred, which Catherine had accepted without hesitation. At 8, Sophie was still the kid who woke up at 6:50 and made her own breakfast and had opinions about oatmeal and a laminated schedule on a rabbit hutch and a name for all 6 hens. She was still the kid who held grief with both hands and refused to let it be bigger than her. She still slept with her rabbit against the pillow and the copper ring on its stand catching the morning light. She was also the kid who had started, over the past few months, to come downstairs on Saturday mornings when she wasn't at 4-H and simply sit in the kitchen while Jason had his coffee. Not talking necessarily, just there, in the specific way you sit with people when being with them is its own sufficient reason. She was the kid who texted Victoria pictures of things she found interesting. A caterpillar she'd found by the coop, a cloud formation that looked like a specific thing she needed a second opinion on, a quote from her library book that she thought Victoria should know about. Victoria texted back. Always. She was also the kid who had, twice now, reached for Jason's hand without thinking about it. Once crossing a street in town. Once when she'd been tired and they were walking back to the truck from the market, and her hand had simply appeared in his, the way hands do when the person they belong to has stopped keeping track of where they are. Both times she'd seemed not to notice she'd done it, and he had absolutely not pointed it out, because some things are more fragile than they look and must be handled without looking directly at them. But he knew. He counted both times among the most significant moments of the year. more than the court dates, more than the documents, more than any official thing that had happened in the legal machinery that had shaped all of it. She reached for his hand. She did not plan to. That was the whole thing. The night before the hearing, he couldn't sleep. Not with anxiety, exactly. Sophie had been right about the different kind of nervous, and this was the good kind, the heavy because it matters kind. But he lay in the dark, and the house settled around him, the small sounds of it, the furnace cycling, Mabel repositioning herself somewhere on the landing, the owl that had taken up residence in the oak in September, calling once and then going quiet. He thought about the phone call. He thought about the legal pad and the 4 columns and the dark numbers of the timeline. He thought about standing in the parking lot of the courthouse with the camera phone photograph of Sophie's school picture, looking at the jaw he recognized on a face he didn't know yet. He thought about his own failures, not to punish himself with them, but to see them clearly, because seeing them clearly was the only way to know if he'd actually moved. He had moved, not as far as he needed to still. He was going to keep getting things wrong with Sophie. The math homework he still couldn't reliably help with. The days when he said the wrong thing about Emily and felt her pull back and had to let her pull back and wait. He was going to keep getting things wrong with the farm. He was going to be inadequate in ways he hadn't discovered yet. That was simply the architecture of the thing. But he was here. He had stayed. Every morning of the past year, he had gotten up and stayed, which was the thing that was never said out loud but was the actual substance of everything. That love, in its daily form, is mostly just the decision to remain in the room and do the next required thing, even when you're not sure you're doing it right, even when the person you're doing it for isn't ready to call it love yet, even when you're not sure you deserve to be in the room at all. He had remained. And in remaining, something had been built that couldn't be unbuilt now. He knew that finally, without needing a document to confirm it. He was asleep before midnight. The hearing was at 9. They drove in together. Jason, Victoria, Sophie. Sophie was in the back seat with her travel rabbit, which she'd brought without comment. The way you bring the thing that has been with you through everything to the thing that ends that chapter. She was dressed in a blue dress she'd picked herself, which was unusual. She wore dresses approximately twice a year, and her hair was done in a braid that Victoria had helped with that morning. Not perfectly. Sophie had opinions about the braid that she'd relayed during the process. Victoria had made adjustments. The result was functional, if not flawless, which was accurate to most things they did together. "You nervous?" Jason asked, catching her eye in the rear view. "I already told you about the 2 kinds," she said. "Which one?" "The good one," she said. "Good," he said. Victoria was looking at the road. She'd worn a gray blazer, the same color as the one she'd worn to the first hearing 13 months ago, which Jason suspected was deliberate. She had her portfolio, which held the documents. Her hands were in her lap. She was doing the thing she did in high-stakes situations. Perfectly still, conserving everything, the way certain kinds of energy are best held by not moving. He reached over and put his hand briefly on her arm. She looked at it. Then she put her hand over his for a second, and then they both returned to their own laps, and the truck moved through the October morning toward Portland. Judge Ham was exactly the same as she'd been 13 months ago. Same glasses low on her nose. Same manner of looking at people with the expression of someone reading text that others haven't been told is visible. She looked at Jason when he sat down, and he had the same sensation as before, that she was reading something written inside him. And he met it the same way, directly, without flinching. The proceedings were more structured than the emergency hearing, with Sandra Okafor presenting her recommendation formally and Gerald submitting his report. The county attorney had reviewed the file and raised no objections. The court-appointed advocate confirmed his recommendation in person. Victoria provided the household documentation. Then Judge Ham asked to speak with Sophie. A bailiff brought Sophie from the waiting room. She'd been sitting with a young court clerk named Thomas, who had made the mistake of mentioning he had a strategy card game on his phone, a mistake that had kept Sophie occupied for 45 minutes. She came in with her travel rabbit under her arm and sat in the chair that was brought forward for her and looked at Judge Ham with the measuring look which, Jason noticed, had changed over 13 months. Still measuring, but the quality of it was different, less defensive, more genuinely curious. Hello, Sophie, Judge Ham said. I'm Judge Ham. We haven't met. I know who you are, Sophie said. You were at the first hearing. I was in the other room, but I knew. Judge Ham looked at her with an expression that was somewhere between professional assessment and something less official. I'd like to ask you a few questions, she said. Okay, Sophie said. How are you? Judge Ham said. Sophie appeared to consider whether this was a real question or a polite one. She seemed to decide it was real. I'm okay, she said. I have sad days, but mostly okay. Do you feel safe where you live? Judge Ham said. Yes, Sophie said. No hesitation. Is there anything you need that you're not getting? Sophie thought about it. Jason watched her think. I wanted 3 more chickens, she said. He said he'd think about it. He hasn't answered yet. She paused. I think the answer is going to be yes, but he's working up to it. In the gallery, Sandra Okafor made a sound that was definitely not a laugh and definitely happened. Judge Ham regarded Sophie steadily. I have a harder question, she said. You don't have to answer it perfectly, just honestly. Okay, Sophie said. A year ago, you came into a home with 2 people you didn't know, the judge said. You'd lost your mother. You had every reason not to trust anyone. She paused. What made you stay? The room was quiet. Sophie looked at her rabbit. She turned it over in her hands once, the worn ear between her fingers in the small habitual gesture that was hers. Then she looked at Judge Ham. I didn't decide to stay, she said. They didn't make me decide. They just... She paused, finding the words the way she found most things, by looking directly at them. They were just there every day. Both of them. Even when I was being difficult. Even when I was sad in a way that was hard to be around. They didn't... She stopped. Her jaw worked for a second. The jaw that was Jason's jaw, holding something in that she'd decided she was going to say. They didn't make me feel like I was a problem they were managing, she said. They made me feel like I was a person they wanted. She looked down at the rabbit. That's different. I know the difference. The room held very still. Judge Ham wrote something, a long something, the pen moving steadily. She looked up when she was done. She looked at Sophie, then at Jason, then at Victoria. She looked at the file. She looked at her notes. This court grants permanent custody of Sophie Brooks to Jason Carter, she said. Effective immediately. The case will be considered closed pending the standard 6-month administrative check-in. She looked over her glasses at Jason. Mr. Carter. Your Honor, he said. His voice was steady. He was proud of that. You came into my courtroom 13 months ago, she said, and I told you to be readier than you thought you were. A pause. By the account of the people I trust in this matter, you have been. She closed the file. Court is adjourned. The bailiff said something procedural. People moved. Jason sat for 1 second before moving, 1 full second of just holding it, the word permanent, the closed file, the thing that had been a desperate overnight arrangement and was now simply, legally, irrevocably real. Sophie appeared at his side. She looked at him. We're done, she said. We're done, he said. She nodded. She turned the rabbit over in her hands again. Then she looked up at him with an expression that was not the measuring look and not the flat look and not the careful look, an expression he hadn't seen from her before, or hadn't seen aimed at him. Something open, something that cost her something to show. I'm glad it's you, she said. Simply. I was really mad about it for a long time, but I'm glad. He put his hand on the top of her head, the same gesture he'd offered in the dark hallway in November, the night she'd pressed her forehead against his arm. And she let him, and he didn't say anything because there wasn't a sentence that was equal to the moment, and Sophie would have been the first to tell him that unnecessary sentences were a waste of everyone's time. Victoria was standing 2 steps away. Sophie looked at her. She walked over and stood beside her, not quite touching, in the particular Sophie way of being next to someone without declaring it. Victoria put her hand on Sophie's shoulder. Sophie leaned into it slightly, the small lean of someone who has been deciding for months whether to do this and has finally decided. They stood there in the Portland courtroom in the October morning light, the 3 of them, improbable, imperfect, still in the process of becoming whatever they were. And it was not the end of anything hard. It was, if anything, the beginning of the harder and better parts. But it was solid. You could put your hand on it, and it would hold. He drove back to Millhaven with the radio on this time because Sophie wanted music, and she had opinions about the station, and Victoria had counter-opinions, and Jason drove and did not intervene in the negotiation, except to eventually reach over and change it to something neither of them had selected, which both of them received with the resigned acceptance of people who understood this was fair. The farm came into view at noon. The fields were October gold, the greenhouse glass catching the midday light, the coop visible at the edge of the yard. Marge was in the yard doing whatever Marge did, which was apparently move with the determined anxiety of a hen who believed something was always about to happen. Sophie got out of the truck and looked at the farm. She did it consciously, deliberately, the way you look at something you're deciding to call yours. Then she looked at Jason. 3 chickens, she said. 2, he said. She looked at Victoria. 2 is fine, Victoria said. 2 is reasonable. Sophie assessed this alliance. Fine, she said. Then she went inside to check on Copernicus and report to Mabel and do whatever Sophie did on the first afternoon of the rest of her life. Victoria stood beside Jason in the gravel drive. She looked at the farmhouse. He looked at the farmhouse. It was still old. It still needed work. The porch step on the left had been complaining for 2 months, and the back bathroom's plumbing, despite the February repair, was developing opinions again, and the greenhouse needed a new section of panel before winter. It was still 12 acres of modest Oregon farmland that ran on narrow margins and required constant physical effort and gave back what you put in, and sometimes less. You know what this is, right? Victoria said. What? He said. This is the part where it gets harder, she said. Not the court part, She gestured at the farmhouse, the fields, the entirety of it. The daily part, the permanent part. I know, he said. I'm not good at daily, she said. I'm strategic. I'm good at the big picture. The daily stuff. She paused. I burned the pasta. Sophie fixed it, he said. She did, Victoria said. She'll probably keep having to fix things I burn. She was quiet for a moment. I'm telling you clearly before we go inside, I'm not going to be the person who has this figured out. I'm going to be the person who's figuring it out. I know, he said. So am I. So is Sophie. We're all figuring it out, she said. That's what it is, he said. I think that's what it actually is. She looked at him. Then she looked at the farmhouse door, which Sophie had left slightly open in the way she always left doors slightly open, as if she couldn't quite bear to close them all the way. Okay, she said. She picked up her portfolio from the truck seat and walked toward the door. Come on, then. He followed her in. Later, weeks later, after the second-to-last warm weekend of fall, after Sophie had named the 2 new hens Agnes and Roberta and spent an afternoon introducing them to the established hierarchy with the diplomatic seriousness of a UN mediator after Copernicus had escaped his hutch twice and been recovered both times with increasing levels of mutual understanding between himself and Sophie, after the back bathroom plumbing had been definitively fixed by a plumber who charged $300 and was worth every cent. Later, Jason sat on the porch in the last real warmth of the year and watched Sophie and Victoria on the edge of the field. They were doing something with the ground there. Sophie had decided she wanted to plant something for spring. Not the market, not for the greenhouse, just something she wanted to see come up. She'd researched it with her characteristic thoroughness and determined that certain bulbs could go in now. Victoria had listened to the plan with her focused attention and said, "What do you need?" And Sophie had produced a list, because she always produced a list, and they'd driven to the farm supply store in town and come back with the bulbs and the appropriate tools. And now they were in the field, in the late October light, doing the work. He could hear them from the porch. Not the words, just the alternating tones of their voices. Sophie's explaining something, Victoria asking, Sophie answering. They were covered in soil, both of them. Sophie was completely unbothered by this. Victoria had long since arrived at an accommodation with the practical realities of farm life that had involved accepting that she was going to own fewer good blazers and was going to be fine with that. Mabel was in the field nearby, somewhere in the tall grass, investigating things at her own pace. The 6, now 8, hens were occupied with the opinions that perpetually consumed them. The oak at the edge of the property had turned finally, the leaves going the color of old copper, still hanging on, still full, refusing to give up the season. He had a notebook on his knee, not a legal pad this time, an actual notebook, because at some point in the past year, he'd started writing things down, not to organize them, but because they were worth keeping. He wasn't a writer, the sentences were plain, but he'd been trying to write down the true things as he found them because he'd come to believe, without being able to explain it neatly, that the true things needed witnesses, and he was available. He wrote, "She reached for my hand on the way to the truck. She didn't notice she'd done it." He wrote, "The farm smells right." Sophie said that. "I didn't know it until she said it." He wrote, "Victoria canceled the document. She told me afterward that she'd done it because she'd stopped being able to imagine leaving. I understand that. It happened to me earlier. With both of them." He looked up from the notebook. Sophie had said something that made Victoria laugh. A real laugh. The kind she still rationed but gave more freely now than she had in October of last year. Sophie was looking at her with the expression she used when she'd made Victoria laugh, the expression that said she'd done it on purpose and was pleased. Some people will tell you that family is something you're born into, that the ties that hold are the ones made of blood and history, and the particular inescapable gravity of people who knew you before you knew yourself. That may be true for some people. Jason was not one of them. What he knew, what the year had given him at its most essential, was that family was also a verb, a daily, imperfect, often unglamorous verb. It was Sophie's laminated schedule on the hutch and the soup she made because she'd decided to be responsible for something living. It was Victoria on the kitchen floor in good clothes, and I'm not ready to make decisions about things I don't fully understand yet, and 3 weeks later canceling the document. It was the copper ring on the windowsill catching morning light. It was every wrong answer on a math worksheet and every jar of sauce and every late night with a fever and every time someone stayed in the room, even when staying was the harder thing. You chose it, was the thing. That was what people didn't say clearly enough. You looked at the imperfect, ongoing, frequently frustrating reality of the people in your life, and you chose them. Not once in some dramatic moment. Every morning, every ordinary Tuesday, every burned pasta, every 3 a.m. of someone's fever, every difficult conversation, every time the easy thing would have been to put less of yourself in the room. You chose them, and they chose you back, and the choosing was the whole thing. In the field, Sophie had apparently explained all there was to explain about bulb planting because she'd gone quiet and was doing the work, hands in the soil, kneeling in the October grass of the farm that was hers now in every way the word could mean. Victoria was beside her, doing the same. They weren't talking. They didn't need to. They were just two people in a field, putting things in the ground that would come up in spring, neither of them knowing exactly what the spring would look like, but doing it anyway, because that was how you made a spring, by deciding in October that it was worth planting for. Sophie looked up at the porch. She looked at Jason. She raised one hand, the same small wave as the day of the evaluation, the same acknowledging gesture that said, "I see you there." He raised his hand back. She went back to the bulbs. He closed the notebook. The last warm light of the season was going gold over the fields. The oak held its copper leaves. The farm held its shape, its slow industry, its particular smell of earth and growing things, and the specific mix of animal and plant and effort that meant someone was actually living here, not just existing. He sat on the porch of his farmhouse in Millhaven, Oregon, and thought about a phone call at midnight that had cracked his whole architecture open, and about a 7-year-old girl with his jaw and her mother's eyes sitting in a courthouse family room with a worn rabbit and a careful face, and about a woman on the other end of a phone line at 1 in the morning saying, "If you're lying to me, I will find out." And he thought that sometimes the thing that breaks you open is the best thing that ever happens to you, not because it doesn't hurt, but because what comes in through the break is more than what you were managing to hold before. He had been a man who was very quietly failing at a life he'd built to need almost nothing. He was now a man who needed a great deal, and had it, and was responsible for it, and was, for the first time in his adult life, actually willing to be responsible for it. That was redemption, probably. Not the dramatic kind, the daily kind. The kind you had to keep choosing after the moment was over, in all the ordinary light of all the ordinary days, with soil on your hands and pasta that was almost right, and a kid who named her chickens after women with strong opinions and a woman who canceled documents when she was sure. The light went. The evening came. Sophie and Victoria crossed the field back toward the house. Sophie explaining something else now, gesturing with the tool in her hand, Victoria listening. Mabel came out of the grass to join the procession, tail going, her one floppy ear tilted sideways in the permanent expression of benign confusion that had, for the past year, provided the household's baseline of unconditional warmth. They came up the porch steps. Sophie looked at the notebook in Jason's lap. "What are you writing?" she said. "True things," he said. She looked at the notebook, then at him. "About us?" she said. "Mostly," he said. She appeared to find this acceptable. She went inside to wash her hands, which she would do thoroughly and for longer than necessary, because Sophie did most things thoroughly and for longer than necessary, and he loved that about her without having planned to. Victoria stopped at the top of the porch steps. She looked at the notebook. She looked at him. "True things," she repeated. "Yeah," he said. She looked out at the field for a moment, the bare spots where they'd planted, the dark earth open in the October grass, waiting for what came next. She nodded once. Then she went inside. He sat on the porch another minute, long enough to hear Sophie through the open window tell Mabel something important, long enough to hear Victoria respond to something Sophie had said, the tone of it easy and certain, the tone of someone in a place they've decided is theirs. Then he got up, put the notebook on the chair, and went inside to his family.